Uh, Good morning and welcome to the Florida Bioethics Network Conference, the 34 actually conference on debates, decisions, and solutions. I'm very glad to be hosting this meeting, and of course I welcome all of you. For more than 3 decades, it's 34 years. This is not meaningless. The Florida Bioethics Network has served a statewide space in which clinicians, ethicists, administrators, lawyers, and policy professionals work in all kind of ethical problems that actually arise in which are not particular, which are very significant in the institutions, in the healthcare institutions of Florida. And the conference has some ideas behind it, which is trying to improve decisions and trying to pair those decisions in the conference with real cases and real scenarios that we have in Florida. My name is Dr. Sergio Litewka. I am the director of the Florida Bioethics Network. I welcome again all of you. And I would like to make just a brief about what we are going to address today with Dr. Ray Moseley, a very well-known name in the conference. We'll look at the history and future of the network itself. Later, we will examine which are the most persistent challenges in clinical ethics, which is how institutions respond to requests to non-beneficial treatments. We will address tensions between immigration enforcement policies and the duty to care in hospitals. And we will close with a broader question that goes beyond the state, which has to do with how bioethics is changing in a changing international order. Those are all the questions that we are addressing today are shaping daily practices and will shape the practice for the year to come. So the purpose of this meeting is not necessarily to reach consensus, but to create a space for careful reflection about difficult situations and the decisions they involve. So again, I thank you, all of you, for being here. Just a quick reminder, we will offer an evaluation that it will be sent also in the chat and to your emails, so you can respond. That helps us a lot, and it's very useful in many ways. And you can formulate the questions in the Q&A space that you have. Before going to the speakers, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Rosario Isasi. She is the new director of the Institute for Bioethics and Health Policy. And so I would like Rosie to say a few words just to start in this meeting.
Thank you, Sergio. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the FBN annual meeting. It's wonderful to see many colleagues and some friends gather here, and you all are very committed to advancing thoughtful and rigorous approaches to the ethical challenge we face across not only healthcare, but research and policy. I also want to briefly share that my new role as director of the Institute of Bioethics and Health Policy at UM is truly a honor for me to engage more closely with this community. I'm especially grateful, and I follow in big steps and fill in big shoes. Those are my predecessor. I want to acknowledge Ken Goodman, whose leadership and commitment helped build and sustain this network. And I look forward to continue that working together. I'm also very grateful to the planning committee, to Sergio, to Ray, and Ray is, together with Ken, really the pillars institution for FBN. And I said, especially acknowledge the planning committee. These meetings take time, care, and intention to bring together. And your work is clearly reflected in the strength of today's program. So also want to acknowledge Dr. Sergio Litewka, who have been a pioneer in global bioethics in Latin America and beyond, as a director of the FBN and this effort, but also Sergio is retiring and not fully retiring because he will continue being engaged in this area, but allow me to take some minutes to be a bit run or across to the legacy of Ken and Sergio's legacy. And finally, what makes this network special is not only because we get together once in a time to exchange ideas, but the quality of engagement, the thoughtful, the passion you bring to this work, how respectfully we bring different perspectives, and how we think carefully and constructively about complex issue. Just look at the program today. And finally, I'm just hope that today's discussions are energizing to everybody, collegial and generative. And thank you, everybody. I look forward to a very exciting program.
Thank you very much, Rosie, for your kind words. Yes, I am. That's true. I mean, I'm retiring, but I'm still attached in many ways to the Institute and to the University of Miami and all the work that we have been done during all these years. So thank you very much for your acknowledgement. And also, of course, you mentioned Ken Goodman. It will be really a, a, an issue if I don't acknowledge all his contribution. And in fact, I cannot by any means compete with his eloquence. But luckily, I have here Dr. Ray Moseley, which is the co-founder of the FBN, and he will help me just to navigate during all with this conference. So thank you very much for again. So now let's start with the meeting. The first speaker, it's actually currently Dr. Ray Moseley. Ray received his master's degree in philosophy and medical ethics at the University of Tennessee and his doctorate in bioethics at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is currently the director of the University of Florida Health Clinics Ethics Service and holds a Grace H. Osborne Professorship in Bioethics. It's a faculty member in the Bioethics Law and Medical Professionalism program in the Department of Community Health and Family Medicine. And also, he has a joint faculty appointment in the Department of Surgery at the University of Florida College of Medicine. He is the co-founder of the and senior board member of the Florida Bioethics Network. I remember, Ray, actually, when those days with Robin Fiore, if you remember, in Miami, and Ken Goodman, those all good days, actually, when those meetings were in person. And maybe, who knows, those meetings will go back to be face-to-face in the future. Let's hope for that. And it's needless to say that Ray played a key role in the development of the Florida Bioethics Network as a statewide resource. So actually, this is the topic that Dr. Moseley, the roots and future of the Florida Bioethics Network. What Dr. Moseley will address today is just particularly the roots of the FBN, namely an update on the progress and developments of ethics committees over the last 30 years, focusing on the current state of the art, ethics service committees, the evolution of ethics committees in the hospital settings, and how the types of programs have changed. And this is something that we are going to analyze during the whole morning, how all the current situation and all the changing scenarios, it's affecting the way that ethics is being already working at the bedside. So Dr. Moseley will also touch on potential type of ethical problems that the hospital are increasingly maybe trying to make a forecast about which will be the problems that they will address in the future. So Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sergio. And I do want to acknowledge the leadership of Ken Goodman over the years. One of the signs of the vibrancy of the Florida Bioethics Network is that the people that have help develop it, that we have the network now that have developed it and keep it alive and well, have created an institution, if you will, the Florida Bioethics Network, that transcends any individual, although it has had important leaders, and we will always recognize those roots, but the purpose remains strong, the network remains strong, and it's going to have a bright future long after, I suspect, long after all of us are here, because we're not going to solve all the ethical issues in healthcare, and we're going to continue having new issues. One of the things I wanted to spend a few minutes on today was talk about, when I say the roots, I'm not talking about the history of the organization itself. I'm talking about the roots of the problems that caused the creation of the Florida Bioethics Network. And that really focuses, when we go back 34 years, when we go back and look at why did we have and why did we want to have a Florida Bioethics Network? And that was because we discovered that hospitals around the state of Florida, around the nation, but we're focused on the state, around the state of Florida, were all dealing with the same kinds of problems. We're dealing with the creation of hospital ethics committees and nursing home ethics committees and hospice ethics committees, but primarily hospital ethics committees. And there was not much cross-fertilization or communication about how to solve those problems, how to create an ethics committee, how it should work, what it should do. And so the idea was, maybe it would be helpful if we got together and were sharing the kinds of problems, the kinds of hurdles, the kinds of successes we had in creating our hospital ethics committees. And that's really the genesis of the Florida Bioethics Network. The very first meeting we had was here in Gainesville, Florida. And it was a conference that I was putting on about ethics committees. And I just happened to invite a few people from other hospitals, and everybody showed up and everybody wanted to know what other places were doing. And that's kind of where we are now. Although we have always had cutting edge issues and conversations and talks and presentations, just like we are going to today with the next two speakers. The real roots of the Florida Bioethics Network, and I still think the main focus is, how do we operate in our institutions with our ethics committees? So I want to take a couple minutes and give you the not so much the history, but the state of the art of where we are with dealing with ethics in hospitals and nursing homes and hospices around the state. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to postulate this and assert this. The term, how you describe your ethics process in your hospital or other institution, is actually crucial. The message you give actually determines, with the name of it and how it's functioning, determines the relative importance of it. I have, in the last few years, gotten away from referring to ethics committees, hospital ethics committees. One, because I think it's a misnomer. We don't deal with every ethical problem that could possibly arise in an ethics committee in a hospital. We deal with the clinical ethics problems, problems that arise in the clinical hospital setting. Not every social issue, ethics issue there is. So sometimes when people hear the term have a hospital ethics committee, they see that in the broadest possible construct of ethical issues and about judgments of right and wrong and good and bad. And so there's often a misunderstanding from the get-go about what a hospital ethics committee does. The evolution of ethics committees has moved in the direction of a service to the hospital. And here at the University of Florida and Shands Hospital, we now have a clinical ethics service. And it turns out that repackaging or renaming is actually a lot more descriptive of what most hospital ethics committees do. They provide a service to physicians, nurses, other healthcare professionals, to patients and to families. They help solve problems, solve ethics problems that are related to the clinical setting. So the difference between identifying an ethics committee as a clinical ethics service is not just one of name, there is a perception difference. In most hospitals, if you're on a committee, same goes with a nursing home, and I'm going to stop saying nursing home and hospice. Just assume that's lumped under the hospital heading. They're different missions in many ways, but lumped for this purpose under the same heading. A committee is usually, in reality, and I'm on quite a few hospital committees. You go to a meeting once a month, once a quarter, and you might look a little bit at the agenda ahead of time, and during the meeting you may participate a little bit, and there may be some takeaway activities that you do, but it's not seen as a vehicle for ongoing activity. Administration views a committee that way. It's kind of a volunteer thing you do as part of a healthcare professional or other person in the hospital setting. You do because that's just part of your general duties. A hospital ethics service, clinical ethics service, is an ongoing activity and involves being called and being involved in ongoing ethics problems. And so it's a service has a quite different connotation. That's really important when it comes to, for example, asking for support. If you ask for ongoing support for your ethics service, that's perceived differently than asking support for being on a committee. Typically, you do not get support for being on a committee, but being part of a service, you do get support. So I think where we're headed is moving towards this notion of a clinical ethics service in a hospital. And I think it's important to consider, maybe you want to modify the name to reflect your actual activities. Now, of course, if you have a committee and you do just meet once a quarter to discuss general issues, policies, etc., then that is a committee. But if you actually are engaging in helping solve problems that arise in specific cases that come up, you're providing a service. So in the future, I suspect we're going to be moving, especially in the larger hospitals, institutions, towards referring to it as a service. A little bit about how we solve ethics problems in a hospital setting. Typically, it's perceived as here's a big problem that has arisen. We'll have a meeting and discuss it. And we'll kind of take a global view and analyze the whole issue that's been presented to us and come up with some advice on it. What I found is that that's not always true in the actual real world. You get questions about, is this an ethical issue? How do we analyze? What are the reasons behind various courses of actions, recommendations, and how to implement those recommendations? The focus in the clinical ethics service world is, what do I do? And what we found is that when a physician, the medical team, or a patient or a family calls for an ethics consultation, an ethics service consultation, it's almost always urgent. It's not, I did a quick look at consults we've done in the last year. Out of the more than 250 consults we did last year, maybe half a dozen were on a broad enough issue where we could address it within a couple of days when we got together a group of people, a typical committee format. almost every consult revolves around somebody calling and we have a problem, we need to solve it now. So the urgency of ethics problems arising in the hospital has dramatically increased, as opposed to the kind of global, we'll talk about this issue whenever we can get a committee together. What that means is that an ethics service has to have availability, and I believe it should be 24/7 availability. The experience that we have here at Shands is about 25% of our consults are after hours or on weekends. So ethics problems come up at the spur of the moment, often suddenly. Sometimes they come up and it's a shame they weren't identified sooner, but they're almost always require a relatively urgent response. And so you have to create a service that will be available when needed, not necessarily after the fact. So urgency in setting up a ethics service operation requires commitment by the people that are going to be available to be on call and be able to have the training to respond. Now, there are a couple different formats that have evolved out of ethics consultation, and this can be carved up different ways, but I carve it up into two different basic differences. One is a facilitation, and one is offering expert advice. So facilitation involves getting the parties together and to get everybody on the same page and to discuss the issue and to come up with a plan of action. The expert model is someone calling the ethics service and asking, what do I do right now? Or what do I do when you come up with recommendations? And can you help me implement those recommendations? Quite a different skill set needed to run a facilitation as to supply expert recommendations. So it takes two different kinds of skill sets. Both of them are useful, and sometimes you have to do both during a consult. Oftentimes, the problem that's identified is based on miscommunication or everybody not on the same goals of care page, and you have to get the various teams talking to each other, and you have to have a facilitation, or you have to get the family on the same page. And so you are involved in somewhat of a goals of care conversation. So that kind of recognition that it takes certain skills and expertise is relatively important. Here at Shands, we've come up with a program that people that are involved in doing consults have to have special privileges, hospital privileges, which requires training to do and lead consults, not necessarily to be part of a consult, but to lead a consult. So one of the common things that happens during a consult is the tendency to solve every problem that you might see, and the move has been more towards solving the problem that's at hand. What I've discovered over the years, and with lots of experience of this, is that most healthcare professionals know what the ethical issue is, actually know how to handle it, but have trouble actually justifying that and implementing it. And by implementing it, I mean, how do you document it in the medical record? What do you actually say to the parties involved to implement the recommendations? An example of that would be when you have patients or families requesting non-beneficial treatment, medically futile treatment. We're going to have a whole presentation on this in a few minutes. But how do you respond to that? What do you say? How do you document that? Those are all a crucial part of a clinical ethics consult these days. The issues are actually some of the same issues we've been dealing with slightly different flavors for the last 30 years. A lot of issues still probably half of consults revolve around end-of-life issues. Advanced directives, withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, proxy decision-making about end-of-life, surrogate decision-making about end-of-life, what happens when families disagree, and do patients actually understand the information to give a valid informed consent? Those are all issues that have been around. The different flavor is how the relative importance and agreement of those have been. One of the things that used to come up routinely, what happens when a family member disagrees with the patient's advance directive? Mama made an advance directive, didn't tell any of the family members. Now the physician has the patient's advance directive, and the family are disagreeing with that. How do you handle that? That's pretty clear. You follow the advance directive unless the family has legitimate reasons to indicate that that advance directive is no longer valid. And we still get quite a few consults from physicians of what do I say to the family in those situations, and how do we handle that? So those are relatively common situations. I want to turn for just a moment before I wrap up, and we have time for any questions or comments. Where are we going in the future? I'm just going to take the advanced directive issue and make a couple comments about how I think we're headed in the future. You may have noticed we have an aging population, and we have an educated aging population and a population that is no longer rooted in the Marcus Welby generation. Those of you who don't know who Marcus Welby is, that's a good thing to Google and find out about Marcus Welby. He was a TV doctor. But we're now in an era where patients' rights are pretty commonly recognized, and the right to refuse treatment is pretty commonly recognized by the general population. Where we're not is being able to provide evaluative data, evaluative information about whether the advance directive is honored when it should be honored, and what to do about it if it's not being honored. I think Medicare is actually heading in this direction about the importance of advance directives. The next step in that is, are we honoring them, and who is not honoring them? And do we have evaluative data to back up that a certain hospital, a certain unit, or a certain physician is failing to honor an advance directive that should be honored, and how much that might cost the patient in suffering, in financial and resource utilization? I think we're going to be seeing, along with AI's ability to extract data from the electronic medical record, more of those kinds of issues coming up. And I think hospital ethics services are well positioned to help make sure that kind of evaluative data is accurate and used appropriately. I'll end my comments there. I do want to note that we have some plans. Sergio, I'm going to jump in and say this, plans to maybe do some workshops on ethics services, on ethics consultations in the future. And I hope more will be coming on that in the coming months about those kinds of opportunities. I'll end there, Sergio, see if we have any comments or questions.
Thank you, Ray. You did a wonderful overview on all the aspects related to many situations that the ethics committees are facing, and what probably some steps for the future. I wonder if some of the attendants have any questions. I don't see any yet. So please don't be shy. Feel free to intervene. I have one, Ray, which is, and you mentioned the advanced directives. From what I see, I don't know how I'm thinking how to formulate it. You mentioned the advanced directives as one of the topics and basically in a very cultural, different background that we have here in Florida. And I was wondering, and that question probably will go also to the next speaker, whether you see that some of the role of the ethics committees are more, in many ways, being as mediators rather than ethics, probably, because what we see, it's, I don't know if you agree with me, many situations that normally in our life as physician, we understand that are end of life situation. It's not about sometimes controversial whether somebody who is competent and need an amputation, and it's more about situations that are, it's the end of life. And sometimes the advanced directives that are present, sometimes not, but it's the counsel that many ethics committees receive, I don't know if that's your experience as well, are situations that normally in our life a physician will say, okay, there is nothing else to do. So do you see that that role of being mediators, it's part of what maybe will be more and more the function of ethics committees rather than other ethical situations that maybe require more thoughtful decisions or definitions?
Yeah, it kind of depends on exactly what we mean by mediation. So it's a mistake to think that, and this is one of the reasons many people think there's no right and wrong answers. Everything's kind of gray. We'll just try to get everybody to agree on an answer. Well, I would argue that's a misperception. Sometimes we don't have a clear answer because we don't have all the information we need, the time constraints, etc. Doesn't mean there's not a best answer uh, given the information we have. So the way I see that is part of the implementation of recommendations is sometimes you have to do some mediation. For example, one of a recommendation of an ethics consult might be the mother is the decision maker. That's the right decision maker. Now that's both a legal and an ethical determination, and that the mother should be making the decisions based on the patient's values. Typical recommendations we give for proxies, and sometimes we have to educate proxies about what their actual role is. And their role is to make decisions based on what the patient would want or the patient's values. And so mediation in the sense of let me explain how proxies work and what kind of educational activities, if you like, mediation to make sure the proxy understands their role is to base the decision on that. Mediation also often happens with the medical team, who I find this an interesting phenomenon. Sometimes the medical team will train a proxy to make decisions based on their own personal views. And what I mean by that is you have a patient in the hospital that's incapacitated. The medical team routinely goes to the proxy and says, we want to run this test. Is that okay? Sign the consent form. We want to do this procedure. Is that okay? Sign the consent form. And we train the proxy to think they are the decision maker based on their own views by that model. Then we get to an end of life issue with the patient, and we say to the proxy, we don't have any good treatment options. Maybe we should be thinking about moving to comfort care. And the proxy says, no, I want you to do everything, aggressive treatment. And I can't bear, and the typical response is, I can't bear to live without my mother. Well, I couldn't bear to live without my mother either, but it doesn't stop somebody from dying. But nonetheless, they are making a decision based on their own views. And so part of what an ethics service may have to do is help with the retraining of both the medical staff to say the right thing. Like every time there's a procedure, you should say, would your mother want to have this procedure? Instead of sign the consent form. And so you don't have to then get to a position on an end-of-life decision to, in essence, untrain the proxy, and which you can't just go in and say suddenly to a proxy, by the way, it's not your decision, although we've been asking you to make these decisions. It's not your decision. You have to make, so we end up just irritating a proxy and irritating the medical team. So that's a mediation, if you will. But mediation in the sense of we want to reach a middle ground, that's really not compatible necessarily with doing the right thing. The middle ground could end up being in a place that is not doing the right thing. Typically, we like all family to agree, but ethically, we don't have to have all the family agree. We need to have the decision maker who represents the values of the patient agree. So, yes, mediation is a crucial part of it, but it depends on the exact sense of a mediation. Long
Yeah,
answer or a simple point.
I totally agree with and thank you for clarifying that about what I mentioned about mediation. I totally agree with you. We have some questions here. One of the questions is, what do you see as the role of Medicare in ethics consultation requirement for transition to hospice? It's very difficult to see.
There's a lot to unpack with that.
Yeah.
Hospice is a choice many people make. I think it's a good choice depending on the circumstances. The idea of pushing that depends on exactly how that's raised. We can provide hospice care in a hospital. We can provide it in a hospice. We can provide it at home. That's a complex. I think that's a pretty complex question. I'm not sure if they're asking a financial question.
Yeah, I think that probably it's thinking about the financial decision of handing a patient to hospice. I think that maybe, yeah.
Yeah, how that's financed, that's out of my realm. Yeah.
I have another one. I mean, we have several, so we are trying to, in order just to keep us on time, we will try just to make a selection. I don't want to, all are very good questions, but I will try just to.
Any yes or no questions?
No.
Okay.
There is another question here about how do you see AI affecting ethics? And whether AI, I mean, this is a conference in itself, I think, how we can use AI to assist with the daily application of ethics in healthcare.
Good question. I'm actually doing research. I got a couple of research projects that I'm involving looking at AI.
Yeah.
And I'm on a couple of committees that are looking at AI in clinical practice. I'll just let you, I don't know if I should actually say this or not, but we discovered that in trying to do a survey of the use of AI in our institution, we found 137 places we're already using AI for various things in various clinically relevant stuff. If you think we're not using it now and how's it going to happen in the future, it's part of our life now. It's all around us. How it can be used, it could be incredibly helpful. Being able to take data points that are seemingly unrelated and draw conclusions. And the same works in ethics also. Good ethics requires good facts and good prognostic facts. If you don't have those, then you end up with general recommendations of the what if kind of recommendations. But the better facts we have, the better ethical decisions we can make. Just as a quick aside, it turns out proxies are not very good at making decisions for their loved ones. The data, it looks to be that they make accurate decisions of what the patient would want about 40% of the time. worse than a coin toss. The AI algorithms that I've played with in my research, in pilot research, looks like AI algorithm can take a set of values of a patient and make an accurate prediction about what they would want in a clinical setting around 80% of the time, twice as good as a proxy. That poses some real concerns. I don't want AI making decisions for me. At the same time, I do want decisions made that reflect my own values. So that's our conundrum, and that's where an ethics service is going to have to step in and help come up with appropriate safeguards.
Yeah, and there are models that are better than others in trying to align those values to what
Absolutely.
we call human values. I think that an interesting topic for the future will be maybe to teach physicians and healthcare personnel in general how to make prompts that can avoid the bias that normally those models could have. Maybe formulating the best way to make the prompts, that the way that you formulate the question will be another option. I have another question. I try to go fast in what we have. Do you have data on whether hospitals have clear processes in place to obtain a patient's advance directives on admission of their wishes, or the wishes are clear to the healthcare team? How to make it clear?
Is there data that shows that?
Data on whether hospitals have clear processes in place to obtain a patient's advance directive.
I have there's not any hard data on that, because hospitals typically do not keep track of whether an advance directive is implemented, when it's implemented, how it's implemented. A lot of hospitals don't even really keep track of the numbers of patients that have advance directives. Typically, they're hard to access because most advance directives are not in an electronic format. We take a PDF of them and insert it in an electronic medical record, but they're not searchable in the electronic medical record. You can't go into, take a group of electronic medical records and search them and see how many people have an advance directive and what those advance directives say. So really, we don't have evaluative data on that. I will say it doesn't mean we can't get evaluative data, but that's going to involve some changes in the electronic health record, and it's going to involve using tools like AI to help get that information. So right now, no, there's not really good way to track advanced directives, whether people are using them, whether there's conversations about them. That's just typically not in the medical record in the access.
Thank you. In order just to keep us in time, I mean, there's a lot of questions. I will stop here, just introduce the next speaker.
Okay,
I
thank you so
apologize.
much.
By the contrary, I apologize to the other question. Maybe if we have some time at the end of this meeting, maybe we can answer. All the questions are quite good, but we have to keep moving on.
Wonderful, Sergio. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker, it's a colleague of mine at the University of Miami, Mike Hoover. Dr. Hoover is an assistant professor of clinical medicine at the Division of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. And he's the chair of the ethics committee at UHealth. Dr. Hoover's research interests include the intersection of bioethics, serious illness care, and informatics. Mike Hoover work examines ways to measure and improve the quality of serious illness care and advanced care planning using electronic health records. Also, he examines hospital-level variability in serious illness and end-of-life care, with particular interest in cause status orders and life-sustaining medical interventions. His topic today is something that probably many of you are dealing all the time, and he makes an interrogation, the futile attempts to address futility at the end of life. So, Dr. Hoover, the floor is yours.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I think Dr. Moseley really brought up some issues that hopefully I'll be able to discuss more. I'll also note we very likely won't have time for the type of question and answers that this talk will generate. The Q&A we can use outside of time, so Dr. Moseley might be able to type in some responses to the questions that are still there. And I encourage all the audience to give your questions in the Q&A. We very likely will address only a small fraction of them, but I'll make sure to make myself available and I'll try to type answers afterwards. You all are seeing just the regular slides, not the presenter mode, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I have no relevant financial disclosures. Some other disclosures, though, that I think are more self-evident in a bioethics conference than maybe some other settings, but I'm going to talk about controversial topics. None of what I'm saying is by any means settled and represents my views or my attempts to present multiple different sides. And if you came for definitive solutions to these very common problems about addressing technologies at the end of life, you are going to leave disappointed. I'm hoping to spur some thoughts and give a framework, but I'm not going to solve anything. We'll skip through my objectives. Hopefully they'll be self-evident for the point of time. So I want to start with a case. Mr. J is a 68-year-old man, a 68-year-old man with metastatic pancreatic cancer who's unfortunately been doing poorly. His oncologist in a recent visit recommended engaging in hospice services and felt there was no more treatment available that would help the cancer. Mr. J declined that recommendation. He was at home and then was having shortness of breath. He was brought to an emergency department where he was found to be too confused to make decisions. His son in the emergency department indicated that Mr. J had always said he would want any life-prolonging treatment and wanted any life-prolonging interventions. He was found to have a pneumonia with sepsis, was extremely critically ill, needed to be intubated and put on a ventilator machine and put on medications to sustain his blood pressure. He was admitted to the ICU, and the interventions were keeping him alive, but he wasn't really improving. The next day on rounds, he was at an academic hospital. The resident on teaching rounds exclaimed, "Why are we doing this? It's futile." So there's a lot that the resident is saying when he makes that exclamation. It's a cry of distress, often of moral or emotional distress. But also implicit in that question, the resident is wondering, ought we be doing this? Should we be doing this? Can we choose not to do this? And futility is really wrapped up in that question, in the ethics conceptualizations of it over time. This is not an uncommon concern. They've actually done qualitative studies. This was back in 2013, where a group surveyed a number of critical care doctors across ICUs, asking if they felt that the care that they were providing was futile. And as much as 11% of the patients that were being cared for were the ICU doctors felt were potentially receiving futile care. And 3% of all patient days in the ICU were clinicians worried that the care being provided was futile. So it's a common concern. And as Dr. Moseley mentioned, is a very common question for clinical ethics consultation. I think he quoted around 50%. For our numbers at as many as 70% of consults deal with end of life, and a large number of those are questions of, what clinicians might call futile care. So again, defining this term futile is really centered around the idea that if we can reach a definition, that may be a situation in which we could withhold or withdraw a treatment of objection, withhold or withdraw a treatment over the objections of a decision maker. That's really essential to trying to define this term. So before we get into that and recognizing this is, a broad audience with a lot of different experiences, I want to back up and actually talk about decision-making in general. So the vast majority of healthcare decisions, hopefully, are happening through, the informed consent process that we're all familiar with in ethics. And that's a deliberative process of decision-making with a patient or their decision maker and the healthcare team presented with information, engaging in discussion of goals and values, And that can include a recommendation from the healthcare team, but ultimately is centered around the patient or their decision maker consenting in an informed way to some sort of decision. Separate from that, healthcare teams can make or may present unilateral decisions that are separate from the decisions or consent of a patient or their representative. That can be as simple as someone coming into a primary care doctor and saying they want antibiotics, and then the primary care doctor saying, no, I think what you need is not antibiotics. This is a virus. My decision is I'm not going to give you antibiotics. And then that obviously can extrapolate to across any number of decisions where the decision making is centered at the level of the clinician or the healthcare team. When that occurs, one of two things can happen. The patient or the representative can sort of agree or at least not actively oppose a decision, which we term assent, or they can actively oppose the decision. They can say, no, I demand that you do what I am asking. And then when you're in that situation, you have conflict. Just to walk through examples of this to go back to Mr. J, we could think about a consent process where the team, talks with Mr. J's son, who's his decision-maker and understands his goals and values, say, I recommend that we don't do CPR. And the son says, I understand and agree, he wouldn't want CPR. There we have consent. In a different situation, the son could say, my father always said he wanted anything possible to stay alive. He wants CPR. And the healthcare team says, unfortunately, in this clinical situation, CPR will not be at all effective. We will not provide this. This isn't a recommendation. This is a decision. And then the son may say, okay, or I understand. And in that situation, you have assent. Now, in the idea of informed assent versus consent, and whether or not that's appropriate is a broad topic that I'm going to leave to the side for this moment. We could do a whole other hour-long talk on the ethics around that and the literature around that. But assent we're going to leave to the side and focus on conflict. So the clinical team says CPR is not going to be effective in this situation. We're making a decision that we will not provide this. And the son says, I disagree. I request or I demand that you provide CPR. Now we're in a decision-making situation where we have conflict. So what do we do? I pause here to address a few things that always come up in the discussion of conflict, and I think there's been a lot of discussion already in some of the questions and some of what Dr. Moseley has said. So I want to make a few points before we dive into it. Yes, and. So yes, we absolutely have to address conflict with better advanced care planning so we understand patient wishes before we're in these situations, and better high-level communication. I already saw some questions about, what do you do in complicated communication situations? I'm a palliative care doctor. I spend the vast majority of my clinical time trying to prevent or mitigate conflict with high quality communication. And we have to absolutely do that. But even with the best communication, we are going to still have fundamental differences in values or wishes between some decision makers and clinical teams, meaning we will be left having to address these issues of conflict, even if we're doing the best communication that we can. And to be clear, we're not. As a healthcare system, we need, or healthcare in general, we need to do much better with communication. But even if we solve that, which would take a lot of work, we're still going to be left with conflict. The other broader issue that always comes up in these kinds of talks is, yes, as a society, we have to begin to grapple better with the limits of healthcare and resource use, especially at the end of life, where we have more and more technologies that are able to forestall death. And what that means in terms of prolonging life or quality of life is a very open question. Yes, these are very expensive technologies. We as a society have to grapple with this. But when I'm talking about conflict for the rest of this talk, I'm not talking about individual bedside decisions where we're making decisions based on rationing resources or saying something is too expensive, or particularly, we don't have enough of something. I set aside the issue of triaging true resource allocation. Like if there's a crisis, like I'm not talking about, the questions of the COVID-19 pandemic where, we were making unilateral decisions potentially because someone was going to have the last ventilator in a hospital. I'm talking more about routine clinical conflict decisions and how do we address those where we're not dealing with a true rationing situation. Okay, so what do we do with conflict? What do we do with a healthcare team making a unilateral decision and the patient or their decision maker disagreeing? Another way of saying this in ethics and principlism terms is, what are the bounds of patient autonomy? So patient autonomy is, and again, everything I'm talking about is not settled, but is very commonly recognized as a strong negative right, but not an absolute positive right. What do I mean by that? The general conceptualization of patient autonomy over the last 50 years has recognized and supported that patients may refuse anything. They can choose for anything not to happen to them, but they don't necessarily have an absolute right to request for things to be done. And so to put that another way, patients with capacity to make decisions may refuse any intervention. If they don't have capacity, it gets a little bit more complicated. The person making decisions for them may have some limitations that are ethically recognized or recognized in statutes, but generally can refuse any intervention. However, patient requests can be denied in some situations. And going back to the idea that one of these situations that we've sought to define through lots of debate and discussion in ethics is patient requests may be denied if the intervention is futile. So how do we define futility? This has been recognized since antiquity. This is a painting of the story of the Danaids, which are the 50 wives in Greek mythology who murdered their husbands and were punished to spend eternity carrying water in a sea. They're never going to be able to fill the basin because the water is always pouring out. Futility, we recognize it, we recognize the word, it's something that cannot be achieved. Futility in healthcare is actually a more relatively recent concept, and it really only appeared in the literature beginning in the late 70s and 80s that the word futile was being debated and defined in healthcare literature. In the year 2000, a group of bioethicists, including some of my mentors, published an article in the New England Journal tracking this use of the word futile in the ethics literature and tracking the debates, and making the argument in the year 2000 that much of these attempts to define futility ran into some serious conceptual issues. Now, this was over a quarter century ago, and I will tell you as a palliative care doctor and a clinical ethicist that I'm constantly running into the use of futility in common clinical parlance in ways that, over a quarter century ago, were argued as conceptually flawed. And the literature has not been able to develop a consensus around this in the subsequent years. And so, as often is the case in healthcare, a concept has really permeated, but it has a lot of issues. And I want to walk through those, really focusing on the idea of how do we define futility. So, beginning in the attempts to define futility in the literature was this definition of quantitative futility. This was the idea that we could define something as futile. And again, recognize that in attempting to define things as futile, we're really saying we're trying to define an intervention that we ought not to provide, even if it's requested. And so in defining this idea of futility, the initial formulations were trying to come up with a quantitative idea. Something could be considered futile if, in some prognostic or quantitative or empiric measuring of that intervention, it was very unlikely to work. So one of the early formulations of this was in an article by Schneiderman and colleagues in 1990, And in this article, the quantitative idea was, quote, when physicians conclude, either through personal experiences shared with colleagues, or consideration of reported empiric data, that in the last 100 cases, a medical treatment has been useless, they should regard that treatment as futile. And so I'll spare you a lot of biostatistics, but if you have a success rate of 0 out of 100 observed cases, you can say with 95% confidence that there's less than a 3% chance of success. So Schneiderman put his nickel down on, if we have a less than 3% chance of success of an intervention, we should consider that intervention futile. That begs the question, what is the right threshold? At what quantitative chance of success should we consider an intervention to be futile and we ought not to offer it? There's been qualitative work that have interviewed much more clinicians, very little patients, to say, what do you think is the right number? What's the threshold? And the range has been anywhere from a 0% chance of success to, in some formulations, some physicians felt that if there was a less than 60% chance of success, an intervention ought not to be offered. So obviously a super wide range. And this is not a clinical or physiologic decision about what threshold we should choose. This is a values-based decision that's going to have very different views. Any of us who have practiced in these spaces have encountered the family or the person whose values are such that if there is a 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1 million chance of success in intervention, they want to take on that intervention no matter the burdens. That's a values-based decision. And so fundamentally, this idea of quantitative futility would require some coalescing at a societal level around a value of what threshold we should be defining this quantitatively at, and we certainly have not done that. We have not done that. Let's imagine we could, which I think would be incredibly difficult. And even if we could agree on what the threshold should be, then we run into the issue of, are we even sure if we can predict this threshold? So we know from tons and tons of work and tons of settings across interventions and across predicting death that clinicians are very inaccurate at prognostication. A clinician may assume that an intervention has a 2% chance of working, and in reality and empiric data, it has a much higher chance. But then what is that empiric data? The studies across any intervention are highly variable. Predicting mortality for someone is very difficult, and depending on the population or how old the study is, you'll get very different numbers. So even if we could choose a threshold for this idea of quantitative futility, we would be left wondering, are we accurately predicting that this intervention is or is not at that threshold? So that's the next problem. Then there's a deeper fundamental philosophical problem, which is, can we actually even predict for the individual in front of us what their actual probability of the chance of success of an intervention or their probability of death is? This is the idea of the reference class problem, which has been described in philosophy. And it's the idea that a population level epidemiology is not an individual probability. We can do a study where we look at thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, and see what happens. And then we have a sense of, did this intervention achieve success? And for what percentage of the people did it achieve success? But for the individual that we're trying to predict for, we are predicting against a reference, based on that data. And so for Mr. J, our case, are we predicting the chance of CPR against a population data of patients who have pancreatic cancer, of patients who have advanced sepsis, of patients of a certain age? Each individual contains an innumerable number of potential references that we would reference against to make that probability. And choosing that reference, we might be not necessarily choosing the right one, or it's philosophically impossible to choose some definitive reference. And so if we are setting the idea of quantitative futility, if we are going to say that we will choose life or death interventions based on some quantitative number, we cannot be positive that this is actually the probability for the direct individual we're making the decision on in front of us. And so quantitative futility is flawed and, I would argue, impossible to implement for a number of ways. So, there was already questions about AI. You can't give an ethics talk these days without talking about AI. AI is not going to solve this problem. AI may be able to yield much more accurate predictions at the population level by taking in, much larger amounts of data and finding patterns that are impossible to find, through human or less complex math. But it is not going to tell us what the right threshold is. That's still a values-based decision. And it is never going to say, because of the reference class problem, with 100% probability whether or not someone is going to live or die. Nevertheless, it's going to create problems. And I have already seen some sort of resurrection of the quantitative ideas of futility that thought were long put to bed, because there's this idea that AI is going to be so accurate that we need to start to use it to define whether or not we should provide interventions. Now, there's also a whole bunch of other ethics talks about the biases that go into these predictions and models and the problems of the ethics of AI around this. But ultimately, it's not going to solve this, but we will face the problem where we're going to be getting these measures coming from AI, like, okay, we have a 99.9% predicted mortality, and what do we do with that? Is that some sort of definition of futility? So we'll have to grapple with this, but AI is not going to solve it. Okay, so separate from the idea of quantitative futility, rising around the same time point, and one that I very commonly see even to this day, used and referenced in clinical practice, is the idea of qualitative futility. This is the idea that if an intervention cannot achieve some defined goal, that it should then be considered futile. In that same Schneiderman formulations of futility, the authors posit the idea of quantitative futility as, thinking about futility as treatments that merely preserve permanent unconsciousness or that fail to end a patient's total dependence on intensive care should be considered futile. So they're saying if an intervention cannot move past some aim or goal that we have established, like achieving consciousness or getting out of the ICU, then it should be considered futile. And this is a moving target that I commonly hear. I am a clinical ethics consultant, and I'm called for consults where, the question is what we're doing futile? The person asking will say, well, this patient is never going to be able to wake up. He'll never be able to get off ECMO, which is kind of like a heart-lung bypass, very advanced technology machine. He'll never get off the ventilator for breathing. He'll never get out of the ICU. He'll never get out of the hospital. He's never going to walk. Trying to define futility around some aim that can't be achieved. The problem with this is these are values-based aims. Again, this is, whether or not whether or not it's an achievable goal or a worthy goal to be kept alive in the ICU, even if you're never going to be able to get out of the ICU, that's not a sodium level. That's not a physiologic decision. That's a values-based decision. And we as clinicians and clinical teams may have different values. The idea that something's futile because a patient may not get out of the ICU, 3 more days of being alive in the ICU may be a value that the family member is expressing. And so in defining these ideas of qualitative futility, we're running into values-based issues. And our potential biases as clinicians making unilateral decisions around this. So the qualitative is really taking these values and implicit or explicit biases, and then adding a quantitative part to this, because this idea of qualitative futility, he'll never be able to get out of the ICU or he'll never survive. How do we decide if we've achieved or can achieve that qualitative end? We have to have some sort of quantitative thought around prognosticating that. And I just spent a long time telling you why, the quantitative issues are flawed. And so quantitative or qualitative definitions of futility, really have not been able to be defined in ways, despite decades of attempts in the literature, that have reached some sort of consensus around definition, surpassing these flaws. So now you've, heard me really address this issue of futility and problems with definition. And it raises the question like, okay, we're using this word in common practice all the time. Is anything actually futile? And again, while no clear consensus has been achieved, there has been some measure of consensus around reserving the term futility for this concept of absolute, or it's commonly called physiologic futility. This is defined as a situation in which a chance of an intervention achieving the intended effect is zero. It just physiologically, whatever we're trying to do medically, cannot do what is intended. And this is not that there's an exceedingly low chance of success. It's not that there's 0.0001 chance of success. There is zero chance of success of the intervention. And we define that as physiologically futile. So to go to this question of CPR that I've used in the example, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, doing CPR, compressions and other interventions to try to resuscitate someone, is a medical intervention that is intended to perfuse the brain when the heart is stopped by pumping the chest, and ultimately achieve the resumption of spontaneous heartbeats for about 20 minutes is the definition of return of spontaneous circulation. So physiologically, CPR can do that in a lot of situations. It can perfuse the brain. It can sometimes achieve, even if there's an incredibly low chance that it can achieve, success in restarting the heart. The situations in which it truly cannot, in which it would meet this definition of physiologic futility, is if someone is decapitated or someone has been so long without a heartbeat that their body shows rigor mortis, with the signs of prolonged death. In those situations, there is 0% chance that doing CPR could perfuse the brain and achieve return of spontaneous circulation. And so in those situations, there's some coalescence of the idea that, yes, this would be futile and we ought not to provide those interventions. But the vast majority of times that we're getting called is not a situation of clear physiologic futility. Unfortunately, or very fortunately, the pathologist is not calling me from the morgue because a family is demanding CPR. The majority, or the vast, the reasons we're grappling with this in ethics is because we're often dealing with cases where it is not clear strict physiologic futility that is being questioned. In the case of Mr. J, the interventions we're doing, the life support machines, the ventilator, the blood pressure medications, they are keeping him alive. They are achieving the goal if the goal is to keep him alive. They're not physiologically futile. And so how do we grapple with those questions, when it does not meet the definition of physiologic futility? And that begs the question, is it ever appropriate to withhold or withdraw over the objection of a decision maker in settings outside of physiologic futility? And what this comes down to is competing ethical considerations. On the one side, in the situation where you have a patient or their decision maker demanding the provision of some intervention, the ethics of their rights, the respect for their persons and values, and the commonly conceptualized patient autonomy is one side of the ethical debate. But there may be competing ethical considerations. The principalisms, the idea that we should be doing beneficence, doing good, our intervention should be achieving some good, questionably how you define that. Non-maleficence, are we causing harm or suffering, and how is that viewed? The idea of whose autonomy is this? Do physicians have their own autonomy in acting or making decisions, or other members of the clinical team? Do physicians have some sort of professional or social contract wherein society has empowered or emboldened them to control or make these decisions in ways that may outweigh patient autonomy? And then, as always comes up, there's this question of resource allocation. But again, I would put that to the side for these bedside routine clinical decisions. So there is, from the 1970s to now, thousands and thousands and thousands of articles about these competing ethical considerations. I'm not going to dive in detail or make compelling arguments on one side or the other. This is really just to recognize that this question of should we provide, or are we obligated to provide a requested intervention, really comes down to the weighing of these complex and competing ethics considerations. And so practically, you've listened to me talk now for 26 minutes or more. The question becomes, what do we do? And the answer that we've largely coalesced around is that it really comes down to process. It comes down to having some way to have some persons, group of people weigh the competing ethical considerations to make a decision for the individual clinical situation about what we do. And so recognizing that this is a common problem in critical care, a group of essentially all of the professional societies of American and even European critical care got together and did a lot of work to come out in 2015 with a policy statement, on responding to requests for potentially inappropriate treatments in intensive care units. And again, so they did not title their paper around futility. They created or recognized this term of potentially inappropriate treatments. And so how do they define this? Potentially inappropriate treatments are treatments that have at least some chance of accomplishing the effect sought by the patient, but clinicians believe that competing ethical considerations justify not providing them. So they have basically packaged this broad term I walked through where things are not physiologically futile, but there may be other reasons in which ethical considerations may favor holding them back or not giving them as potentially inappropriate treatments. So directly from this paper, I have some illustrative examples of this. Each of these could be heavily debated, and obviously they're not remotely encompassing yet all potentially inappropriate treatments. There are any number of them. But to give, examples to make the point, there's a question of, should we intubate someone, put them on a breathing machine if they have really advanced end-stage dementia? Should someone in a persistent vegetative state be started on dialysis? Or like the case of Mr. J, should CPR be provided in a person with poor prognosis from a very advanced malignancy? In each of these situations, it's not physiologically futile. If someone with end-stage dementia is having respiratory failure, putting them on a breathing machine likely can oxygenate them. It can achieve the physiologic or intended effect. If you dialyze someone in a persistent vegetative state, you will clear their blood with the dialysis machine. It's not 0% chance of achieving its intended effect. And similarly, even in the case of Mr. J, while the chances of having successful CPR are incredibly low, they're not 0. And so then there are the competing ethics considerations. So what do we do with that? So the policy statement kind of divides between emergent decisions where there's no time for deliberation and then less urgent decisions. For emergent decisions, it recommends clinicians make their best judgment, and it makes the point, when you're making these decisions, think about if you, in hindsight, have to go through a deliberative process, do you feel like you could justify this decision as you weigh the competing ethical considerations? For less urgent decisions, it recommends a multi-step process that includes conflict resolution, notifying the decision makers in writing of the unilateral decision that will not be provided over their disagreement, obtaining a second physician evaluation, engaging in interdisciplinary, really involving multiple professional discipline review through some sort of institutional committee of the conflicted decision. If the committee then decides on the side of the healthcare team over the conflict of the decision maker, then offering transfer to a different institution that may honor the decision maker's wishes. There's a final offer of judicial court level appeal. And after all of those steps, if the decision has been made that the competing ethical interests favor withholding or withdrawing the intervention over the objection of a decision maker, then it may be ethically appropriate to do so. So a very involved multi-step process. So that was from a national body of recommendations. Where does this fit in the law? Anything I'm about to say in the next couple of slides is not remotely legal advice. I think there are multiple lawyers on the call. The key in all of this is to get at your institutional level or whatever, in whatever situation you're dealing with, the direct advice of your own legal counsel. I say that having learned some lessons from being part of a group I and colleagues published in JAMA Health Forum, a sort of epidemiology of the state statutes addressing unilateral clinicians about life-sustaining treatment. if you want to fill your inbox, your email inbox, with a bunch of emails about your misinterpretation of state statute, then try to publish a paper with a bunch of doctors, no lawyers. But in this paper, we attempted to examine state statutes for whether or not they addressed how to approach these potentially inappropriate treatments, or where there are medical or ethical considerations that the healthcare team feels they should not provide the treatment. And we found that a large number of states did mention this in the statute, either directly, the idea of withholding what clinicians viewed as medically inappropriate treatments, or there might be space in statutes that may not directly apply, but make reference to the idea that clinicians are not required or obligated to perform interventions that they feel violate their morals or their conscience. And so we sort of published a map of what these states look like. You can take a look at it. There are some states that are much more explicit and proscribed. Texas is an example. Many states, including California, others, do make mention of what to do if they're in their statute, if there's consideration of medically or ethically inappropriate treatment. Virginia is an example of one that is very proscribed. It talks about a process you initiate using hospital policies and committees if physicians feel that something is medically or ethically inappropriate. And then it walks through a process that is pretty close to the policy statement process, and then says if at the end of a 14-day period the conflict is unresolved, there has to be a number of steps. There's a lot of statutory text I'm leaving in the ... but you have to offer a transfer and do all these things. But then the statute itself says the physician may cease to provide the treatment that they've determined to be medically or ethically inappropriate, subject to the right of court review. And there are a number of states that do things like that, have wording that's somewhat like this, though Virginia is one of the most proscribed. We are in the Florida bioethics talk. What does Florida statute say about what we ought to do with things that we feel are medically or ethically inappropriate? Question mark. There is some statutory text more in relation to surrogate decision-making around physician conscience, but it is not proscribed like other states. And, you know, there's varying interpretation, and really your own legal counsel's interpretation of this state statute is what matters. So that's statute, but both statute and the national policy statement make reference to having hospital level policies to address some of these issues. What does that look like? So I and colleagues did a survey by emailing a multi-question survey on a critical care listserv to ask questions about what is in your hospital policies around the responding to these requests for potentially inappropriate treatment. We tried to get actual hospital policies and ran into a lot of barriers, so we developed this very detailed questionnaire to see what was in the policies, and then received anonymized responses. Well, we got responses from 93 health systems that represented hundreds of hospitals, geographically diverse, all 50 states and Puerto Rico. And we found that 64% of respondents said that their health system addressed potentially inappropriate treatment, but there was incredibly wide variability across hospitals, even across hospitals in the same state that are, you know, subject to the same state statutes. There's just a huge variation in how hospital policies respond to these things. What we found also is that very few hospital policies mirrored the National Critical Care Society's recommendations. Only the majority of hospital respondents included processes to seek expert consultation or provide the patient or the surrogate the opportunity to transfer. And even those, you know, were nowhere near 100%. And then across the other recommendations, like even obtaining a second medical opinion, appeared much less frequency in hospital policies. So wide variability and limited concurrence with the professional standard policy statement. So wide variability on policy, but what's actually happening in practice? So we followed that up by interviewing a small group of ICU clinicians, nurses, and physicians in geographically diverse academic centers. And we found that, one, there was a lack of awareness of hospital policies and a lot of sort of mythology around what the policies said or whether or not policies even existed. And then a lack of alignment in hypothetical scenarios. We would say, in this critically ill patient, would you do X, Y, Z? And they responded, but we had access to their policies, and what they responded and said their policies would support didn't actually align with their policies. So practice, may be variably influenced even by the policy. A group of colleagues did a much more in-depth set of interviews across other academic centers, and in 100 qualitative interviews found that there's really a whole mix of things happening where practice and belief about policy then influences how the policy is written, and all of that is happening in state and national culture. So a lot of variability, we think, in practice. But what is the actual data? So we don't really know. And one of the reasons I think we don't know, and we address some of this in this idea of, do we have documentation of advanced directives and what actually happens to patients? We have even less documentation or the ability to find when there has been conflicted or unilateral decision or withholding or withdrawing. And so it's very hard. You can't go to large Medicare data sets of millions of patients and query how often is this happening. So we have very limited data. Just quickly for this slide, there's, there've been a few studies where single groups at small center or, at single centers or a couple centers have gone deep into chart review to identify cases of unilateral, conflicted DNR. And what we know from decades of literature is just, less than a couple hundred cases. And some of this is from a really long time ago. So we have very limited data. And that's just for CPR. For other life support interventions, even less. So we just don't know that much. But we do know and wonder that there's very variable policies. There's the possibility based on policies and lack of awareness or response to policies for even more variability in practice. And so when there's variability, I very much worry about disparities. This was a small study done during the COVID-19 pandemic at 2 Chicago hospitals, where they did have the data because of processes that were put in place to track these conflicted unilateral decisions where DNR was withheld over objection as potentially inappropriate. They compared these situations and tried to control for clinical variables. I will say that this was an observational study, and it is very difficult to control for clinical variables. And so we absolutely have to take this data with multiple grains of salt, but there's enough here to be concerned. In these hospitals, compared to looking at race and language, compared to a reference class of white patients, Black patients were as much as 3 times or close to 3 times more likely to have a unilateral conflicted DNR instituted. And Spanish-speaking primary language patients were, over 3 times. There's much we can say about the statistics and, the flaws of an observational study. And this is not, completely indicative of, race or language-based disparities. But there's definitely enough here that raises my concerns about when we are doing these unilateral type decisions, we may be worsening already known disparities in healthcare. So now you sat through the whole talk, and I'm even a couple minutes over, but we started late. So what do we actually do? That's what you want to walk away with. What am I supposed to do in this situation? Well, we're not going to solve this in this talk, but I think one of the things we do is work together. And this is a good plug and a leverage for utilizing the Florida Bioethics Network. We have opportunities as a group to data share and benchmark. Is one group actually doing something wildly different than another? And in so, do we have disparities? Shared education, shared policy alignment. We really should, because we're all dealing in the same state with the same statutes, see how our policies can come together. And we should legislate at the state level for, appropriate legislative interventions in these types of issues. I have acknowledgements, including Ken, who's been acknowledged quite a bit. Here is my contact information. As I knew we would have very little time for questions, but if we want to push a little bit because we started late, I'm happy to try to respond. If not, put your questions in the Q&A and I'll type responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hoover. This was a wonderful presentation, and I am willing just to allow us a little bit more of time because I hate just to ignore questions that are coming. So I have one here, and let me read that to you. I don't know, I think it's related to some information in Florida that I am not aware of. It says, regarding the ability to refuse to provide futile care, Florida Statute 765-1105 states that if a healthcare provider or facility is unwilling to carry out the wishes of the patient on the treatment decision of his or her surrogate or proxy because of moral or ethical belief, and transfer to another provider for facility cannot be effective within 7 days, then the provider or facility must, and that it's between quotes, carry out the wishes of the patient or the patient's surrogate of proxies. Given this, how can a clinician or facility refuse to provide futile care? I don't know if you're aware of that resolution, Dr.
Yeah,
Hoover.
so that's what I was referencing when I said the surrogate part of the advanced directive statute. You need to, whoever wonders this question needs to work with their institution's legal counsel on interpretation. So everything I'm saying is very much, I'm threading lines, and I'm by no means providing any legal advice, nor am I a lawyer, nor am I skilled in interpreting statute. What I would say is that as we approach physiologic futility in some of these decisions, the medical interventions truly cannot achieve the intended effect. That is not a clinical decision that it may be viewed as not a clinical decision that is based on our moral or ethical beliefs, but on strict medical decision making. And so the closer you get to physiologic futility, or certainly at the point that you're at physiologic futility, we may not be dealing in that part of the statute. And unlike other states, there is nothing in the statute that guides us on what to do if something is medically inappropriate. This statute is around making decisions around our moral beliefs.
Okay, I have another question, and also Ray, feel free to make any comment if you are willing to. Can you share a case that challenged your ethical framework the most, and why?
I think that I'm happy to sort of talk offline with whoever's asking that question, but I think that would require me to think a little bit more and take up much more time than we can potentially devote based on the time we've allotted.
Okay.
I have a
Ray, any comment?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Huber, excellent overview of that. I have a couple comments. From my observation, decisions made about medically futile treatments and requests for them happen all the time in the hospital, and physicians routinely say, no, that's not medically indicated, that's not medically appropriate, I'm not going to do it. Surgeons usually put it in terms of not a surgical candidate. So those decisions are made all the time. The key phrase, I think you rightly point out in this part from 765, is based on moral or ethical beliefs as opposed to strict medical criteria. So the advice I always give about medical futility is the better the data we have that the treatment was not medically appropriate or outside of the standard of care, the stronger the case can be made that it shouldn't be provided. And so I think that's a key phrase. The question I have is an ECMO question. ECMO has was a bridge to transplant, a bridge to let your lungs heal themselves, and that's how it's traditionally been used. We're starting to see ECMO being used as a life-prolonging procedure. The question becomes, because ECMO is incredibly expensive and is takes a lot of effort to implement it and keep it running. Is that going to be something that we will handle as an allocation of scarce resource problem, or is that going to be are we going to be able to hold nice criteria of when we're going to provide it and not provide it for those that demand that? And should we list that in terms of when we're talking to a patient with stage 4 lung cancer that's dying? Should we say, we could do ECMO and keep you alive an extra month?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And again, ECMO is like the heart-lung bypass machine that can be used, for a much longer time than previously in surgeries. And patients can even be awake and talking and eating on this heart-lung bypass machine, but they have to be in an ICU. Though even now, like they're using ECMO outside of ICUs, and it's going to be used more and more. I think that's an evolving question because depending on where you are right now, ECMO might fit the true scarce resource triage allocation, meaning the 2 or 3 ECMO circuits available in the geographic area might be being used, and we're making decisions truly about rationing them. I think it's going to be used more and more, and will over time fall more into this question of what is potentially inappropriate, and the competing ethical considerations. And the resource utilization, I think, is the tough one, because that's a very high resource utilization, but clinical decisions, if it's not true rationing around this is too expensive to use, I always shy away from clinicians making that as their competing ethical consideration at the bedside. But that goes back to what needs to be grappled with at higher levels, at societal levels, around how we should be using these super expensive things.
Okay, thank you, Ray. Thank you, Dr. Hoover. Also, we are going to keep moving with the next speaker. Thank you very much again for your very thoughtful presentation. Thank you. Our next speaker is Cathy Lively. Dr. Lively will address a topic which is very pressing in our days in Florida and elsewhere, which is when ICE knocks at the hospital door, Florida's hospital between immigration policy and the duty of care. Dr. Cathy Lively, professional and educational background combines healthcare, law, and ethics. In healthcare, she has experience as a critical care nurse in adult and neonatal intensive care, case management, and as a program director. As an attorney, her practice has been in family law and mediation. She is a faculty teaching associate with the School of Professional Studies for Bioethics at Columbia University, and a peer reviewer editor for Columbia University Voices in Bioethics. Advisory board, she's a member of the advisory board of the FBN, and she was, during 2023 and 2026, a visiting scholar of UM, and particularly to me, a very helpful support when we were discussing about normothermic regional perfusion and its implications in organ transplants. So, Cathy, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. And can you see my screen?
Yes, of course.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The topic I want to talk about today is when ICE knocks on the hospital door. And first, anything I say today is my own opinion. I've got no conflict, no financial disclosure. And a point I would like, also no legal advice. I am a lawyer, but this is not legal advice nor meant to be. One of the points that I would like to bring out in this is Dr. Moseley said, the time to address, the time to discuss should be before we begin, before the time of immigration enforcement knocking on the door. So we're going to look back as to the timeline as to immigration enforcement in healthcare. This started with prior to whenever we still had protected spaces. Protected spaces for immigration enforcement really started in 1993 with the determination that enforcement should not be done in certain locations. At that time, it was particularly looking at schools, churches, places of worship. In 2011, that was expanded to include specifically hospitals. Where we saw the biggest, the largest increase, the expansion, the Mayorkas Memorandum in 2021. Essentially, that expanded significantly. It was no longer only healthcare facilities, it was now healthcare facilities broadly, not just hospitals, also social service entities such as places that would offer food pantries, shelters, domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, also emergency relief. This also went on to the adjacent areas, the sidewalks, the areas immediately surrounding. At that time, protected areas considered something very important. What activities or services were provided at the location, number one, and number two, what is the importance of those activities to both the individual receiving services as well as to the public. The idea behind the policy was to avoid immigration enforcement if it would deter or refrain individuals from seeking essential services or obtaining essential needs. This went on until January of 2025, whenever there's a complete upending of this. At that point, the then acting Secretary of Homeland Security issued a new memorandum expressly stating, and at that point, rescinding and superseding all prior policies from 2021. Importantly, that replaced the concept of considering essential services, essential activities with discretion and a healthy dose of common sense, whatever that may be, allowing for enforcement on a case-to-case basis. Essentially, what this means, yes, immigration enforcement can take place in a healthcare facility. Immigration enforcement and laws are under the regulation of the federal government as to setting as well as control. We've known this all along, but if there's ever any question, consider some of the executive orders and the Department of Justice memorandums in January of 2025. Essentially, if we summarize these, that federal government is control, looking at any type of interference, what was deemed as sanctuary jurisdictions. If it was deemed that individual state, local actors were seeking to interfere or to stop immigration enforcement. Department of Justice made it clear, as well as the executive order, as to concerns as to loss of funding, as well as potential legal action, both from a civil and criminal liability. Therefore, this is going to impact as to the response and the consideration. There are the states which have certainly enacted and are complying well with immigration enforcement: Florida, Texas. Florida Statute 395.3027 from 2023, requiring hospitals that accept Medicaid to ask about immigration status. Texas followed a year later with their executive order, but as I think we all know, this is asking a patient who comes into a hospital that accepts Medicaid, are you a citizen, lawfully or not lawfully in the United States? This is not going to impact care you received because of EMTALA, but consider what they may do to the individual when asked. Hospitals then collect the information as far as the number of undocumented immigrants, the cost of providing care, report quarterly to the healthcare agency, who then reports annually to the state. A concern, if the costs are being monitored, how close is that to being de-identified, and importantly, the impact. When the individual seeking medical care is asked something that profound, and with the rescission of protected spaces, is that not going to invoke anxiety, fear, and avoidance of seeking medical care? When we look at what immigration enforcement may do within the healthcare setting, it's going to be real clear that we need to consider the difference between public spaces, warrant and without warrant. Currently, immigration enforcement can conduct enforcement activities without a warrant on certain circumstances, particularly if it is in a public space. There's different areas of immigration enforcement: surveillance. That can be monitoring from a distance, across the street, down the block, not necessarily on the premises. That can be done without warrant or probable cause. There's also the concept of a tool called site inspection. Essentially, in this tool, if the immigration enforcement officer has a reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts. Basically, they believe that there is an undocumented immigrant in that area, or as stated in the statute, certainly not my words, an illegal alien, then they have the ability to go on. But the law as it reads currently, the federal law, is they cannot do that in a private space that's a non-public unless they've got a warrant or consent. However, nothing in the law will prohibit immigration enforcement to conducting the activities in an area accessible to the public. We need to look at this as how this applies in the healthcare setting in particular. The interrogation, interviews, and questioning. Essentially, an immigration enforcement officer, and if you look at the law, it's rather strange, as any other person can ask someone about their immigration status. They can inquire, and immigration enforcement can do this without warrant, as long as the individual is not restrained and free to leave. I would suggest consider this in a healthcare setting. If it's in the hospital and the lobby, the individual is waiting for a family member to pick them up, their mobility is limited due to the medical condition. Are they not restrained from moving? A consideration. But they may ask, important to understand too, depending on the answer, it may allow for further investigation, including detainment or an arrest. Also important to understand is that the surveillance activities of immigration enforcement, including within healthcare, is not limited to the physical presence. This can be done through various sources, which could impact patients, and I'll talk in a moment about family and visitors. It can be done through geofencing, which is the monitoring of who was present at a location at a specified time. This could be done through security cameras. If it were in a community, in an environment, neighborhood, it could be done from Ring cameras. It can also be done through security and video footage. Also, the aspect of surveillance and monitoring through biometrics, facial recognition, GPS tracking, and something that is very important to consider, particularly as advances in technology continue, as to data mining. When I look at data mining, an area that I've done some research on and discovered more is concerns as to the partnership between, in this context, immigration enforcement and data brokers. Data brokers are essentially private companies that collect personal information and data from first parties, such as could be from a cell phone provider, from a utility company. One point was from a supermarket and to purchases. Initially, the data brokering really was geared to marketing, used a lot by predatory loans, high-risk insurance, but it's become more and more used into law enforcement and in immigration enforcement. One of the reasons why there's the data broker loophole, essentially, law enforcement can obtain this information directly by purchasing from a data broker without the need for a warrant, without the need for a probable cause, and without consent. One of the largest providers is Palantir, who falls into the data broker loophole. Here we see a lot of concerns regarding data sharing. On January 27, 2026, the BMJ, formerly British Medical Journal, published an article reporting that immigration enforcement agents in the United States are using an app developed by Palantir, drawing from health records of Americans to find and detain people they deem to be illegal immigrants. Essentially, looking farther, it is data sharing between the Department of Health and Human Services, along with commercial data sets such as a data broker and public data sets for an analytical development, again, by Palantir. So when I mentioned the concept of the public versus private and the data broker loophole, this goes to the Fourth Amendment. I have never practiced criminal law. I'm not going to get into the criminal law aspects, but would say you've got the Fourth Amendment protection. We've all heard of this. This is essentially the protection against unreasonable search and seizure, which would include obtaining the private medical or private information about an individual. This concept essentially prohibits the unreasonable search and seizure where there is a reasonable expectation of privacy. So important to remember. Essentially, Fourth Amendment applies when there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. This is why it is so important to understand in the healthcare context, certainly, the difference between the public and private space. In a public space, no warrant is required for an investigation. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy. In the healthcare setting, this could be the lobby, the waiting room, sidewalks, adjacent area, the entry grounds, anywhere where the public can enter. One of the concerns is the emergency department waiting area, where it's both patients and the family members, somebody accompanying them, deemed to be, does not have the same level of protection as a private area. When you get into the private area of the hospital, reasonable expectation of privacy exists. It's going to require a warrant, probable cause, or consent. Your exam rooms, the patient rooms, private areas, areas marked private, areas with restricted spaces. When we're looking at this, please also consider the concept of the public view doctrine. Essentially, what this is saying is anything that is in public view, be it a record, a document, a person, an item that is available to be seen by the public, is not protected. Where this may apply, maybe not necessarily in the hospital, but in a clinic or in a waiting area, if there is a record of the names that is open on the desk. Certainly need to consider. So what do we need to look at? Whenever I said in the beginning, consider the impact of the policies. And I would encourage not to consider too closely on the idea of the actual or narrow focus on the immigration raid. Are we going to see that it is possible? It would be legal, but more importantly, more profound and far reaching is the concern, what is the impact of this type of policy? The impact of anti-immigration rhetoric, laws, and policies, and the risk onto enforcement. Number one, this is going to undermine trust, particularly within a community. A healthcare provider is deemed or viewed by that community to be an agent or an arm of immigration or law enforcement. It also, the policies and the risk and the very risk and the threat is going to create a culture of fear, leading to a chilling effect. And when I was preparing for this in an article I found very recently from the New England Journal of Medicine from 2026, the title of the article, Health Consequences of Immigration Enforcement in U.S. Communities by a Dr. Melissa Belli, suggesting that immigration enforcement in the current context be considered and recognized as a social determinant of health, leading to a potential public health crises. One of her arguments for this was the findings that's been reported that responses to immigration enforcement and the threat of immigration enforcement in certain contexts mirror that of trauma-related cases. And the important factor that the analysis shows how that the barriers to healthcare through immigration enforcement, discrimination, and fear shape the health influencing behavior of immigrant communities. And this is so critical considered, again, that we're looking at the policies and the threat, not just narrowly focusing, and how this is going to impact not just the undocumented patient, but the community. We mentioned barriers. Immigration enforcement and threat is going to increase. It's going to create and increase existing barriers to healthcare. In 2015, Karen Hacker et al. Did research and determined 3 levels of barriers to healthcare. Policy. Policy are the laws, the restrictions. This would include laws such as with ACA, that undocumented immigrants are not able to acquire or to purchase insurance, medical insurance off of the marketplace, and restrictions that date back as to what an undocumented immigrant may or may not have access to. These are the policies, the rules, the regulations, some of the orders and the policies that I already spoke about. Healthcare system is the hospital itself. This would include complicated, complex registration processes, kind of intersecting in the requirement of asking the patient who's admitted to the emergency department, are you a citizen lawfully or not lawfully in the United States? Also to consider the level of potential discrimination based upon undocumented status. The research has found this does exist. We may all say today, no, we are here, we support the right to access. However, the reports, the studies have shown that this does not always exist. When we look at this, consider for a moment some of the laws that may be objectionable were enacted by elected government officials. And not surprisingly, there are individuals within the healthcare community and the healthcare setting from the administration on down that may have supported that. I have heard, and actually I've had peer reviewers on an article that I published come back and say, do we actually know that the undocumented immigrant is entitled, has the right to access care and the arguments? We need to consider that within the healthcare system. Also, the individual level. This is the individual, the undocumented or the authorized immigrant seeking care who's got the barrier because of these type of parameters. This would include lack of resources, their language barriers, and the fear of discrimination, discovery, detainment, deportation, leading to avoiding care. The threat of immigration is going to lead to a delay of care. There has been significant reports of research on this, patients needing cancer treatment, dialysis, and other matters. Another article I found very recently from a Megan Wade, an OBGYN, who reported her own experience in caring for an undocumented patient who was pregnant, 36 weeks pregnant. This patient was high risk, advised for seeking treatment on twice a week for fetal monitoring. Patient was in complete compliance until there was increased activity, immigration enforcement in her community. At that point, she made the decision to stop seeking treatment for fear of risk of, again, discovery, detainment, deportation for herself and her family. Dr. Wade, in doing the ultrasound, after she was called in by the tech, realized there was no heartbeat. The patient, sobbing and crying, asked and blamed herself, I should have been to the clinic. It was also reported in February of 2026, a survey done of 500 women, 20-some% reported that because of immigration enforcement threats, they stopped seeking prenatal care. I did research early when I did my capstone for my doctorate on the other impact, not just in the barrier to receiving care, but considering undocumented immigrants, really immigrants in totality, are at a higher risk of becoming unrepresented. This is due to multiple factors, two of which are primary factors in a patient becoming unrepresented. One is their lack of prior care, and two is the lack of trust in the healthcare system. These two factors are really exacerbated when we look at what is the impact on advanced care planning and on the 4 Ds of medical decision-making as set forth by the American Bar Association. Knowing that there is the concern as to lack of trust, let's see how this implicates on as to a living will. Within a lot of marginalized community, there's hesitancy to complete or to be a part of a living will out of fear that that is a tool used and the perception that's going to be used to deny care based on ethnicity, race, documentation status, or the inability to pay. But looking at the need for a surrogate decision maker, when Dr. Huber talked about the surrogate, ideally, there's the delegated through the appointment of or the determination through the advanced care planning of a healthcare surrogate agent or healthcare power of attorney. However, if we are looking at the concerns regarding this population and the concerns of discovery, detainment, and deportation in this community, I would argue that number one, there's 3 concerns. First, the immigrant patient may not have family readily available. Family and friends may be in their country of origin. They may be here alone. But if they have family, friends, out of protection for that person, for the family, they may be unwilling to delegate anyone out of fear of discovery. On the other hand, the individual who may be there to be delegated may say, no, I cannot get involved. I cannot risk the exposure. If this applies to the delegated, I would argue it goes to the next step even more, the devolved. Devolved is a default statute, essentially the statutory hierarchy of who would act in the healthcare agent if there's no one delegated. We're going to see the same objections. Hence, we've got a patient who's admitted, they become incapacitated, there's no designation, there's no one to determine from devolved. We're going to have the unrepresented patient, hence the need for the displaced or the guardian. One other area where I found important We've seen a lot of research, a lot of publication as to the harm to the patient, certainly the obvious and most recognizable. However, what about the family, the visitors? Certainly the family and visitors are an important factor in healthcare. We can get into the fact of all the harm we saw in restricted visitation after the pandemic, but although there's no restriction on visitation within the laws as to immigration, what is the impact and the effect? First of all, family, friends, visitors are at a high risk. Number one, they're going to be in public areas quite a bit more. They enter, exit through the public area, walk from the parking lot, the garage, to the hospital, to the setting. They're in the lobby, they're in the waiting room, they're in the coffee shop, they're in a public space. They don't have the same level of protection. There's also the issues as to the security footage from security cameras, both outside and inside of the healthcare or of the hospital. Another factor at the system level. I don't know about your community, but in my own community, Palm Beach County, most hospitals, if you go to visit a patient or to enter, if you want to go into the patient area as a visitor, a vendor, you're going to need to produce identification. And most hospitals now take the photograph of the person. Some will give a little sticker that you put on to show who you are there. Look, I worked in a critical care setting in a city hospital. I completely respect the need for security, for protecting the staff, the patients, the privacy. However, when we look at this context, what is done with that information? I've done some research on it. I know of one particular hospital that maintains the information on any visitor for a period of 12 months. The question remains, what is done with the information? Where is it obtained? Particularly as that person. If they have to show identification and they do not have a real ID, the federal ID required, is that recorded? Who has access? Hence raising concerns as to data mining, scraping, and further information, and the risk of data brokers and data sharing. Certainly, if family and friends are concerned as to exposure for immigration enforcement, they may be hesitant to accompany, to visit, or to see the patient in the hospital. Further may lead to patients being afraid, wanting to avoid and deter seeking care to protect their family, or that they've got no one to assist. The other big challenge that we all need to consider is for the healthcare provider. These type of laws don't just impact one person, they're broad, particularly as to the healthcare provider who's now facing challenges in the ethical and legal obligations. Ethics and law don't necessarily coincide. They don't always align. There can be conflicts, particularly whenever the ethical or the legal obligations, the requirements of the law conflict with ethical obligations. Here they're walking a tightrope. Whenever they have to decide, are they going to follow their ethical obligation of prioritizing the patient or the obligation to comply with the law and the risk of not doing so? Attempting to maintain this balance and to navigate can easily lead to moral distress and burnout, particularly when you're looking at such strong implications and obligations. And looking at this challenge, I would go from a quote from Dr. Altaf Sadi, a medical doctor at, I believe, Harvard, and a physician for human rights. We are not agents of law enforcement. We should do everything possible to prevent the erosion of trust and the patient clinical therapeutic alliance. You can see where this can become difficult and concerning. So what do we look at? And I would start with preparation and action. I want to be very clear when I'm suggesting preparation, this is not obstructing, it is preparing, following the duty to protect the patient, staff, and the hospital. Healthcare facilities have the obligation, and we're looking in Florida, the obligation typically to protect, we'll see that in emergency relief, such as preparing for a hurricane or a storm. This is preparing in the event of immigration enforcement, and how do we protect while complying with the law? Requiring compliance with the Fourth Amendment, with the requirement for a warrant into private area is not obstructing. However, blocking immigration enforcement or hiding a patient, then you're moving into a much different realm and the need for consideration. and looking at the preparation, moving upstream from the individual level to the policy level. At the individual level, consider and ways to from the healthcare system for community outreach, providing the opportunity to reduce fear, misunderstanding, providing information, education, and referral to resources and opportunities for expansion. In moving into the community, looking at trusted spaces that are safe, working with trusted agencies and organizations, if possible, healthcare providers and lawyers from the immigrant community to reach out farther. And when it is available in your community, somewhat limited, is working with medical legal partnerships to provide the resources. That's the community level and potential patients. However, when you are looking at patients within the hospital, providing meaningful education and referral to resources. The idea is reducing fear and misunderstanding. Moving next level to the healthcare system, this is the need for policies and procedures. Policies and procedures should include both the balancing, maintaining both the legal and ethical compliance that needs to be done in navigating. Addressing policies and procedures to reduce implicit, explicit bias and discrimination. Policies and procedures that will protect the patient without violating the law. This can include also concerns. Again, I'm going to also focus again on the emergency department because of the area, the waiting area, and the exposure. Designating someone within the healthcare facility, depending on the size, it may be one, it may be more persons who are educated, aware of integrating with and interacting with immigration enforcement. The ability to read a warrant, to understand if it is done correctly, and to gain or allow access, and to take the steps necessary to prevent. An alert system whenever immigration enforcement is present, so steps can be taken to protect. Educate both the healthcare providers, the staff, as well as volunteers on aspects of maintaining the balance, complying with both ethics and the law, immigration issues impacting patients, balancing the conflicting areas, and managing immigration questions from the patient population. At the policy level, it's really easy when you're in this, you start to look and say, I'm going to react, etc. When we look at that, I would encourage the following. First, there's an ethical responsibility to advocate both from the AMA, American Nurses Association, as well as healthcare ethics. However, we want to look at what level. As Matthew Winnie has said in one of his great articles, you want to look at the spectrum, the start of at a level of advocacy, starting with advocating without resistance. This does not mean legal advocacy. This can be community education, educating others within the field, writing an article, writing an op-ed, making aware of, so looking at policies that will increase access, make care safety, benefit the patient and the staff, and seeking to change policies that are harmful. As noted in Matthew Winnie's article, there's the levels of advocacy. This can go from the very simple, I just talked about, the whole way up to professional disobedience. Even on something this alarming, one needs to really, really consider enacting and defying the law. There can be significant ramifications. The need for caution and justification for action is going to rapidly increase as the severity of the action or the advocacy increases. I encourage anyone to consider what is the harm both to the individual, risk of criminal prosecution, civil action, but also to your colleagues, to other members of the staff, to patients. If that individual is harmed or is removed, are you able to provide care? To the healthcare system and to the community, keeping in mind as to the potential for prosecution such as obstruction of justice, interfering, and loss of funding. And looking at this, another statement from the American Medical Association from January 27th, but January 26, 2026. Looking at the implications, the American Medical Association is deeply concerned by reports of immigration enforcement activity in and around hospitals and emergency rooms. It's a tactic fueling fear among patients and hospital staff alike. When people are afraid to seek medical attention for themselves or their families, it threatens their health, impedes the ability of physicians to render care, and ultimately undermines our oath and best serve our patients. Physicians must be able to work in spaces that create a sense of safety for all, not fear for our most vulnerable. I would argue that this statement is very applicable both to physicians, but also could be dealt more broadly to the entire healthcare community. We can see that there is the impact. In conclusion, the immigration enforcement in a healthcare setting, or importantly, not just ICE storming in, but the threat is going to have a significant impact, both to the potential patient, families, staff, providers, and the community. We need to prioritize preserving healthcare facilities as spaces essential for individual health, integrity of the healthcare system, and societal well-being. I'm going to take one moment. I did do some research as to implications of individuals who have been impacted by enforcement. There are two stories. In the upper corner, Rosa Maria. This was a young girl who was brought into the United States. She had cerebral palsy, was being treated in the United States, developed a medical complication, was being transferred from one facility to another, was stopped by ICE enforcement or immigration enforcement, who monitored her, stayed in the hospital, and monitored with her doors open at all times until such time she could be discharged. Upon DC, she was detained and placed into an environment and detainment center away from her family. There was involvement and she was released. Sarah in the bottom corner was a young woman. She was under detainment at the time, brought to the hospital by immigration enforcement, was in the need of brain surgery. At one point, immigration enforcement intervened, removed her. ACLU filed a case and she was released. In the upper corner, Brandon, this was a young man who was brought into the United States through trafficking, was found in the back of an unvented van, was in a coma, admitted to intensive care. You see the man in the corner, that was his father, also undocumented. Immigration enforcement came in. In that particular case, it was understood that immigration enforcement entered through consent by the staff. I will note none of these three cases occurred in Florida, but they are examples. There's also an example from 2026 at an NIH facility where the individual came into the hospital for treatment. She had been on record whenever she brought her identification. It was not a real ID. Someone from the NIH contacted immigration enforcement and she was picked up and detained. So we are seeing it happen. It is admittedly not on a large scale at this point. And again, it is a risk we need to consider, but most importantly, to consider how do we act now to help mitigate any damage and to serve the patient population, protect the integrity of the healthcare system in totality, and to protect society. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to contact me on the topic. I think it's an important topic we all need to consider, and particularly as to the inherent risk, both to a patient population, but also to the healthcare system.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lively. It was a great presentation with a lot of concerns. I have a question.
Did I stop? Just want to make sure that my screen's off.
Yes, your screens
Great. Okay,
are.
thank you.
Yes. You are not sharing the screen anymore. I have a question for one of the participants. I will reformulate that a little bit with the permission of the person who is asking, because he's asking, how is Palantir collection of information from medical records for immigration enforcement purposes not an outright violation of HIPAA policy laws? I'm not very sure that Palantir, which is a database integration model that is being used for many federal agencies, immigration and many others, are already in use. So with the permission of the participant, I would say, given that immigration enforcement agencies use data integration platforms like Palantir, to combine information from multiple sources? What protection exists to prevent protected healthcare information from entering those systems in ways that could undermine patient confidentiality or trust?
Well, when we're looking at it, I should have made it clear that this is not necessarily the direct healthcare information, but it may be information such as what is maintained by the Department of Health, or if you're looking at that, it's not necessarily the confidential medical records protected by HIPAA. And if it is information that is obtained from other sources, not the direct medical record, but that there's access to care. If it's not, HIPAA is pretty narrow. And if it's not a medical provider, if it is an outside source in a governmental agency, it may not be protected information. There's examples such as where there's actually been tracking onto mental health, surgical procedures, etc. It's not the medical record, okay? That's where it needs to be clear, but it is health-related information. So Health and Human Services has records, particularly to Medicaid. There's also the policy that information can be shared between governmental agencies, hence raising that up. But you've got the risk, and with the ability to obtain information from multiple sources, it is, look, I'm not an AI tech person, but it is certainly possible to start to put that together, multiple data sets to de-identify and to track. But there is the report that Health and Human Services is sharing data with immigration enforcement based upon the policy that they're two separate entities, and Health and Human Services is not a medical provider, hence is it protected.
Thank you. Do you see any role of the ethics clinical committees in this situation, if any?
I know that there's been the talk that they don't want to hear it, they don't want to deal with it, but it is a policy, and perhaps in working with developing policies and procedures that fall within, and particularly focusing on the parameters of the ethics. Sometimes this particular issue is addressed so much more into, for example, risk management. But what are the ethical, and how can we navigate and find the way to do the balance? Not just protecting the patient, but what about the staff? When I brought up the concerns regarding the healthcare providers, what can the ethics committee do to help formulate policies and procedures that will better enable the individual confronting these issues to balance the ethical and legal obligations?
Thank you. Dr. Moseley, you have any comment or question before we go to the next speaker?
That was an excellent talk.
Thank
A
you.
lot to ponder on that. It's hard to separate the emotional from the thoughtful response.
Indeed, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Cathy. It was a wonderful
Thank you.
presentation, as all the others that precede that one. So now we are moving to our last speaker, who is Dr. Jonathan Moreno. Dr. Jonathan Moreno, other than being a close friend of mine and a close friend of the Institute for Bioethics for many, many years, he is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, a fellow of the Hastings Center, a member of the Philadelphia College of Physicians, fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine, faculty affiliated with the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University, and a member of the Committee of Human Rights at the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Dr. Moreno work has been supported by many grants: National Institute of Health, Greenwald Foundation, Wellcome Trust, the U.S. Department of Defense, and he is a prolific writer. Actually, this presentation that he's going to make now, it's about his last book, Bioethics and the Rules-Based International Order, which takes us a little bit beyond Florida to a more broader scope of what could be the future of bioethics in turbulent times. But he's already working on, he had other books like Absolutely Essential, Everybody Wants to Go to Heaven, but Nobody Wants to Die, On the Risk, The Body Politics, and many others. He has published more than 1,000 papers, articles, reviews, and op-eds in different media. And he was also a senior fellow of the Center for American Progress in Washington. He served in 2008, 2009 as the President Barack Obama transition team. For those who are also interested, Dr. Moreno will visit us at the University of Miami. I think at the end of May, we will make all that information available for all of you. We will make his conference at the University of Miami for those days. I think it's going to be 29. I have to check the agenda, but it will be by the end, the 28th or 29th of May. And we will make that conference hybrid, so all of you will be able just to attend his conference once he visits us in Miami. And of course, those who want to be in person are invited to do that at our university. So without further say, Dr. Moreno, thank you very much for being here, and we are just eager to hear you.
Thanks, Sergio. Can you all see my first slide, my title slide? We're doing well. I must say, when I was teaching during the pandemic, I didn't have that much anxiety about what I was going to talk about, so much as losing the connection to my students online. So I'm happy that the tech is working out today. I have to say, I'm coming to you from a hotel room in Boston. I gave a talk at Harvard yesterday in the bioethics program, and listening to Dr. Lively's talk. If misery loves company, they're talking about all the same things in Massachusetts. I gave a similar talk. In fact, this talk is evolving, as you'll see in a few minutes. It has to evolve pretty much every week at the moment. I gave a talk at Loyola College Medical School in Chicago a few weeks ago. Before that, University of California, Irvine. I don't know if it's comforting or not. Everybody's going through the same thing in one way or another. But I'm going to jump up to the 100,000-foot level from Dr. Lively's talk, and this is about some of the themes in this book that Sergio mentioned, absolutely essential, which I started writing. I don't know when. Somebody asked me yesterday, when did you start writing it? I don't know when you start writing a book, but it was certainly putting the proverbial pen to paper probably something like 5 years ago, when it was pretty clear that the tectonic shifts of geopolitics were shifting. I had actually given a couple of talks about the role of bioethics with respect to international relations a few years before that. And it just seemed to me to be timely. It's turned out to be a little more timely than I might have wanted. Sergio mentioned that I published a few other books. These are a few of them in which I've tried to expand the scope of bioethics, or see bioethics in terms of the history and sociology of the field. Mind War is about the brain and national security, the body politic, which that's a book I wish I could read right now. The subtitle, The Battle Over Science in America, related to what I'll be talking about today. Under Risk, about the history of human experiments and bioethics and biosafety, biosecurity. But this book, which then, thank God for really good graphic artists, because I had no idea when MIT Press asked me if I had any ideas for this cover. I said no, basically not. But I thought this was really quite brilliant. Cells and continents. So I said already, this is a moving target, and this was an interview that Susan Maloney from Brookings did with Ezra Klein in the Times a few days ago, and I think everything that I say in the next few minutes has to be seen against the background of what's going on right now. My burden in this talk is to try to convince you that geopolitics really does have a lot to do with bioethics, and bioethics has a lot to do with geopolitics. But that's my extended argument in the book. So, one thing, I have great sympathy for people who try to reach conclusions in literature, and in this case, reach the conclusion that as there was the title of this piece in 2022, that Trump failed to institutionalize an anti-global agenda. And in the spirit of a great and underrated baseball player and very much underrated philosopher, Yogi Berra, familiar to some of you perhaps, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And I am not going to try to make any predictions about the future in this talk, although it is sorely tempting. But I think what we do learn, and this is a good reason for us not to do predictions, we can often be wrong. And so again, with much sympathy for the authors of this piece, it just was written a little too early. In this spirit, I love to tell the story about Zhou Enlai's encounter with Henry Kissinger in 1973, which some of us are old enough to remember 1973. And those of you who aren't, let me remind you that Nixon went to China, brought Dr. Kissinger with him, and Kissinger had an extended conversation with Zhou Enlai, kind of a side meeting, and Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai to talk with him a little bit about Marxist theory of revolution and history. And according to the story, Kissinger said, well, for example, what about the French Revolution? How does the French Revolution fit in to Marxist theory of history? And Zhou, according to the way this is told, thought for a moment and said, too soon to tell. Now, I love that story, partly because it satisfies our prejudices about China. They think in terms of thousands of years. We think in terms of the next quarterly report from our TIA CREF or whatever it is. But it turns out it was a mistranslation, that Zhou thought that Henry Kissinger was talking about the French Revolution of May 1968, when the students closed down the university and pretty much closed down Paris. As one of my journalist friends says, that story was too good to fact check. Nonetheless, the spirit of it is the same. It's really too soon to tell. So the book has a chapter about what political scientists call the rules-based international order. And it took me way too long to read the literature of international relations to try to figure out what was going on. But in general, people date the notion of international order and state sovereignty of imperial states, not liberal democratic states, from the Peace of Westphalia. That system was clearly breaking down by World War I. People could see it was breaking down. That's why Wilson tried to do the League of Nations. This was becoming increasingly unstable. World War II really forced people to rethink the international imperial system, in which might makes right, as the 19th century philosopher Grotius said, and instead tried to think in terms of an interconnected global system at many different levels, from economics to scholarly exchange, and in particular science, one that would be so interconnected that it would be really hard to take it apart and would create more stability than the old imperial system. So, we're all familiar with the UN organizations, but there are also international security agencies that we're thinking more and more about these days, like the one for atomic energy, chemical weapons, biological and toxin weapons, and so forth. And these agencies also have, I think, a relationship to bioethics. So, you can fill in your own slide about this. What have been some of the threats to the rules-based order through 2025? And I think, there are lots of reasons this is happening. These are only some of the reasons. I do think that we people interested in these topics have, since the end of the Cold War, have underappreciated the importance of ethnic nationalism. I can say more about that. I do think we are seeing elements of ethnic nationalism, not only in the foreign policy of other countries, but in the foreign policy of our own country. Might have something more to say about that. Now, look, there are a lot of criticisms of the rules-based order. The Chicago political scientist John Mearsheimer, who I met years ago, thinks that the rules-based order is basically an illusion, was a myth. It's really always been about power in Mearsheimer's view. What's clear is that it certainly legitimized colonial activity. It established a certain kind of hegemony. That's not a word you hear in bioethics. That's a political science word that I've learned. Hegemony of the great powers. And in moving into the 21st century, the notion of the rules-based order doesn't really take into account globalized markets, corporations, philanthropy, and certainly new forms of communication like social media. So limitations to the rules-based order may be even illusory. Now, we knew this was coming, we being, people who follow these issues. I mean, I think since 2015, 2016, there's been a lot of commentary about a diminishing rules-based international order. And Russia, obviously, Putin, not at all happy with the hegemonic US, which has dominated the rules-based order since World War II and really considered as a smokescreen for American power. This has been a problem, according to the political scientists. This was something that was coming. There was no way that U.S. hegemony was going to continue indefinitely. What's changed is, I think, the way that this is accelerated. And you can see the way this is accelerated in so many different ways that, you're familiar with just reading op-ed pages casually. What I think is really striking is was the language of the national security strategy. You have to be kind of a geek to read this, but this is the Trump administration's national security strategy, which is quite different from the Biden national security strategy that emphasized the rules-based order. And I think especially this lower paragraph is really quite fascinating, because it's basically coded language for the way people were talking 100 years ago. The idea that NATO members will become majority non-European, what does that mean? That's coded language, it seems to me. And we can talk more about the coded language later, if you like. So this is not to say that the U.S. has always been, playing ball. This is not a radical organization. The Council on Foreign Relations published this a few years ago. The U.S. very often has not signed on to international conventions. There are constitutional reasons that the U.S. doesn't sign on to some conventions. Those reasons are better explained by constitutional scholars than by me. If you talk to people in the State Department, as I did a few years ago about this, they'd say, well, it's true, we don't sign many of these international treaties, but we do go to the meetings and we do follow the treaties, even if we don't sign the paper. Whereas they would say a few years ago, these other countries, they sign the treaties, but they don't really pay attention to them. Now, that's what I was told by people who were in the State Department, as the State Department was known a few years ago. So here's one of my favorite stories about international diplomacy and the rules-based order. At the end of World War II in Potsdam, as the big three, then including Truman rather than the late departed Franklin Roosevelt, there was a conversation reported by one of Truman's aides that had to do with the future of Poland. And somebody said, well, the Pope is very concerned about the future of Poland. There are a lot of Catholics in Poland. It's a Catholic country. And Stalin supposedly said in response to this concern about the future of Poland and what the Pope thinks about all this, supposedly tweaks his mustache, bigger mustache than I have, and said, how many divisions did you say the Pope has? Stalin, in other words, was not really buying the liberal international order. This was an appeal to the old imperial order. Now, again, this story is not undisputed. Again, too good to fact check, but tells you something, particularly in light of the current Pope's response to the current problems that the country and the world are facing in Iran and elsewhere. I do think that we have seen, and this is not original with me, people who work on international human rights have been saying this for months, that with regard to what's going on now in Iran and Lebanon and Gaza and in the Sudan and in Ukraine, there has been a weakening of humanitarian norms, particularly with regard to military considerations, military medical ethics, and medical neutrality. I especially want to refer here to another, I think, very revealing story about the first Geneva Convention, which was the result of a businessman in Geneva who had business trouble. He somehow had the idea that the Emperor Napoleon could bail him out in a business deal. He heard that the Emperor Napoleon was about to lead his army in a battle in Italy. He went to the site of the battle where he heard the Emperor Napoleon was going to be, hoping to get his attention to do a business deal. He arrived at the battlefield a day too late, didn't get to see Napoleon, but he did witness the carnage of the battlefield and proceeded to help the locals with the dying and severely wounded soldiers from both sides, and had the idea that there should be some kind of international effort to take care of soldiers wounded in battle. By 1864, that became the first Geneva Convention, and we still have the ICRC now, the International Red Cross, Committee on the Red Cross, whose business is mainly not to be the primary caregiver on the battlefield, but rather to go to states and non-state actors and explain to them what the rules are. So finally, I'm getting to bioethics. What I've been on for 10 or 15 minutes, Sergio, finally talking about bioethics. I argue in the book that bioethics is both a creature and an exemplar of the post-World War II order. So the question in the book is, and the question I continue to ask you and my other colleagues that I'm talking to about this, what would it mean for bioethics if the rules-based order is diminished? What are the implications? What would be the implications of a diminution of the rules-based order? I think in many ways, modern bioethics, and I'm going to try to make this case to you in a few minutes, modern bioethics is a creature of and has bootstrapped itself based on the rules-based order post-World War II. And this has allowed American bioethics, as in so many other things American, the soft power of the movie industry of Hollywood, this has allowed American bioethics to have its own soft power. Try to go somewhere where, anywhere in the world where they're doing what they call bioethics, and try to avoid the topic of the four principles. I'm coming back to that. And I think what Bob Baker says here is very, very true, that bioethics is an ethics of governance conventions grounded in human rights, but we are very often not aware, although I think we're becoming more aware, given recent events, that modern bioethics is grounded in conventions around human rights. So I'm violating all the rules of PowerPoint slides here, but I want to explain where the title of my book comes from. The first sentence of the Nuremberg Code, I think probably everybody in this electronic room, this virtual room, has written or thought about or talked about voluntary consent or the nature of consent, informed consent, implied consent, presumed consent, surrogate consent. But we haven't really talked about the notion that consent, according to the judge's Nuremberg trial of the Nazi doctors, is absolutely essential. So part of the burden of the book is to try to show that what was happening here in the doctor's trial was not only that consent is absolutely essential for the conduct of human experiments and to be done in an ethical way, but also that consent is a critical part of the rules-based international order. And they, I think, were quite intentionally, they being the allies and in particular the judges in the doctor's trial. The goal here was to bring practices of medical science within the ambit of the new rules-based order, including in particular the ethics of the life sciences and medicine. So this is a slide in which I say what I just said to you, that there's a special sense of consent in the new rules-based order that we don't generally appreciate. Here again, violating the rules of PowerPoint slides. A reason that many of us in bioethics don't appreciate my assertion is that we don't know about the Nuremberg principles. Those are not that's not the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg principles preceded the trials in Nuremberg, Germany after the war, and they through the UN General Assembly, they set the legal framework for sanctions against war criminals. And again, they preceded and legitimized the trials in Nuremberg, Germany, and elsewhere in Germany that took place after the war. And also, by the way, the Tokyo trials, which were pretty much catastrophic for reasons I can talk about. Although there were war crimes trial in Tokyo. They were not nearly as high impact as the trials in Germany. So obviously a central issue, a central part of the rules-based order, according to the argument I'm making here, is the notion of consent. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, which this is the, again, famous first sentence of the Nuremberg Code, written by the judges after the trial. The 7 people who were hanged among the Nazi doctor defendants were not hanged based on the Nuremberg Code, because that would have been ex post facto justice. The Nuremberg Code didn't exist before the trial. But the judges were so taken aback that there were no recognized international rules for doing human experiments that they decided to write their own code. Now, the consent doctrine is a formalized doctrine of consent. I am not arguing that physicians didn't get, and surgeons didn't get consent from patients in the previous history of medicine and surgery. We can't know exactly what happened, but certainly we have anecdotal evidence that often doctors and surgeons did get consent, particularly for example, for amputations that really required some kind of therapeutic alliance. But it certainly wasn't a formalized doctrine globally, and that was, I think, what happened at Nuremberg. Many people, by the way, conflate the Declaration of Helsinki, the first draft of the Declaration, the first version, which is now, I guess, the 8th draft, with Nuremberg. It's different from the code. The Declaration of Helsinki was an attempt, as I explain in the book, on the part of the medical profession, the international medical profession, to retake control over the ethics of medicine. They did not like the idea that the judges and the lawyers in Nuremberg were running the ethics of medicine. They wanted to be in control, and the Declaration very much gives more flexibility to medical investigators than the Nuremberg Code does. And so that's a case you can, I think, appreciate very much, and I tell that story in the book. I do think that there's been a certain trickle down in the 50s and in many places, particularly in the US and some Western European countries, from the experiment domain to the clinical domain. And I think we can see this very clearly if we look at a book that was published in 1956 by Loyola University Press. The author was Edwin Healy, a professor at Loyola University in Chicago. And I had fun pointing this out to my colleagues a few weeks ago at Loyola University in Chicago, that it was their professor of medical ethics who published this book in 56 through the imprint of their press. I stumbled on this book some years ago, and it continues to fascinate me. And I want to show you why it interests me so much. This is 1956. What to tell cancer patients, according to Professor Healy. And this is the case. Concealing the nature of his disease from a patient. Miss A has chondrosarcoma. Tell me, she pleads with Dr. B, knowing, do I really have a cancer? Dr. B, knowing that Miss A has ample time to prepare for death and wishing to spare her needless mental suffering, answers, your pains are due to arthritis. Now, I don't know how many dozens of people we have on the call right now. I'm tempted to go off the call, Sergio, and just add, make this the quiz. Was this the right answer or not? I'm not going to press you on that. I'm not even going to ask Dr. Litewka, who's practiced in a couple of countries, what the right answer is. You want to tell us, Sergio, what's the answer to that question?
I am from the time in which we were forced to not tell the patients the real case of when they have cancer. So, of course, it really bothers me a lot, because that was part of the institutional policy those days at most of the hospitals, at least in Argentina. I'm talking back in the 70s or the early 80s.
Well, it's fascinating how globalized this was. And one of the things I've learned over the years is, as you know better than I do, you're really the international guy, but bioethics is a global enterprise. It's one of the topics of the book. And indeed, the former old-fashioned doctor-oriented medical ethics, as we say in this case, as you've said, is quite globalized. But there's a particular personal reason that I was fascinated by this, and Sergio knows this story. In December 1957, my mother was diagnosed with achondrosarcoma. The tumor was in the back of her right shoulder. And this is the only time I'll ever get my picture in the New York Times. I think you know this picture, Sergio. A couple of years later, she was diagnosed. I don't remember my mother ever in a sundress because in January 1958, she was amputated at the clavicle at Memorial Sloan Kettering and saved her life. As Sergio knows, she lived a long time. She lived another 50 years. Some people get healthier as they get older. It should happen to all of us. But she managed quite well, despite the fact that there was no rehab. Her rehab, incidentally, at that time consisted of fitting her for a shoulder cap of papier mâché, which she had to replace every 6 months or so. I remember when the boxes came to our house. So my mother was quite a remarkable woman. You can Google her. She was a famous therapist. Clearly, that made a big impression on me, probably in many ways got me into medical ethics. It will not surprise Sergio, although I got to say, Dr. Litewka, you're showing your age. This was Dr. Healy's solution. This is, by the way, a very casuistic approach that many of you will recognize. If everyone at her age does have at least a mild case of arthritis, his answer is not morally wrong. Now, he does explain, he explains that, well, if she really wanted to know the entire truth, she would have asked, are all my pains due to arthritis? So, we like to preserve hope. And I absolutely very much appreciate that. I'm 73 years old. I want to have hope. And I wanted family members who are very ill to have hope. But the other thing is, if you really know how to ask a question, you need to have gone to law school or gotten a philosophy PhD, because she clearly didn't know how to ask the right question, according to this explanation. Now, I've given you my anecdote personally. Sergio's told you about his experience.
Let me interject. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's relevant. One of the cases that really bugs me even today, and that goes to that, and I won't interrupt you anymore. Mm-hmm. But since you provoked me, this is when I started as a resident, first-year resident, I was asked to do a gastrostomy to a patient who had an esophagus cancer. He couldn't eat. He has dysphagia. And the patient, I went to see him every day, and I was young. I had a lot of time. And he established a good relationship, a good rapport with me. And one day, he was a tailor. He said, because I was always, my dress was particularly bad, the way that I was dressed. Didn't change until today. He said, I'm a tailor. When I get better, I will make you a suit for you. Tell me, what do I have? And because I was pressured by the hospital, and I was pressured also by my own conviction that telling the truth will be inflammation of the esophagus, you will get better with time. And every day he asked me, can you tell me the truth? Mm. And one day I went to see him. He was still at bed because he was getting cachectic. He was getting worse. He covered his head with the blanket and didn't want to talk with me anymore until the moment he died. Still, that image today haunts me. So since we are talking about personal issues, I think it's important how not only it affected the patient, but also ourselves in the way that we were not doing the right thing doing that. So.
Well, as I'm not a physician or a surgeon, I can't top that. I mean, but it is something that I remember when I got into clinical ethics in the 80s. I heard often people say, people know. They find out a family member lets something slip, a nurse, a doctor whispers, uh, and yeah. So I appreciate that, Sergio. But you weren't alone, and your institution wasn't alone. And this is the famous I think in clinical ethics, this is a pretty famous survey. It was done in 61. So we know that these anecdotes are generalizable. These were practices and these were policies. Um, uh, and yet, within 18 years, and those of us who lived through the 60s and 70s know some things happened. This attitude, at least, whether people actually practice this way or not, people knew that the answers were supposed to be different by 1979. Now, this is a survey. This is not an observation, right? We don't know what people actually did. But I think we can be pretty confident that things were changing in practice by 1979. And you might well have had a different conversation with that patient by 1980, 1981. I don't know when this happened. Perhaps some places were a little slower to modify than others, and some still have not, right? So we know that some places are not doing anything any differently. But at least in the US, things were changing. Now, of course, we have the very timely publication of Principles of Biomedical Ethics. There are very few books in any field of knowledge that have structured the whole field the way this book has. As my friend John Arris once said, the Principles of Biomedical Ethics is the Borg, those of you who are Star Trek fans will appreciate this, that ate bioethics. Because every time Tom and Jim published an edition, in the next edition, they would digest the criticisms of the previous edition. In fact, I have to change this slide because this is really now in edition 9 that was completed apparently, I guess just before we lost Tom, a bit over a year ago. The principles are recognized all over the world, sometimes to the frustration of people in various parts of the world, but they have become the way that the U.S. U.S. bioethics has been exported to the world. And John Evans, who I quote extensively in the book, the sociologist of bioethics at UC San Diego, has said this very well. The principles allowed bioethics to get into the clinical setting, particularly into the educational setting, so that in the 1980s, when I got started in clinical ethics, you could fit these items on a 3x5 card the way you might your algorithm for chemotherapy. Now obviously it's on a slide, right? They were very convenient. I would want to ask you, and there's some other background stuff on this slide about the relationship between the Belmont report and principles and Tom and Jim's principles. It's an interesting thought experiment because as I'm sure you all know, the principles are outlined in this order in the book. After the pandemic, it would be interesting to rewrite the book. I'm not going to do that. Make justice the first principle. How would the analysis of justice ripple through the analysis of the other principles? And this is something that we can talk about some more. It's kind of hinting where I'm going with this. I want to give you a different kind of case study. Clinical trials in Russia. I followed this with great interest because I have some colleagues there and colleagues who have had to leave Russia, students from Russia. And, when the invasion of Ukraine happened, there were thousands of clinical trials. I think it's something like 6,000 clinical trials going on in Russia. You see that to the number here, 6,275 by October 2023. Most of those trials have ended. Some of them were ongoing for a while, but Global Pharma has not started new clinical trials in Russia or Ukraine, by the way. And colleagues in Ukraine have complained about this. And this was not for ideological or philosophical reasons, because it was so hard to get material in. They weren't sure that their sites were going to be functional given wartime. But I think this is unique. Global Pharma was not in a position of dominance this way during the Cold War. So this is kind of an interesting result of the globalization of the pharmaceutical industry, that you could have countries that are at war that are removed from the global pharmaceutical research and development system like this. But it's not only that the Russians have been isolated. There has also been, in the case of Russia, some self-isolation. And Sergio and I have talked about this a lot. It's quite interesting that, I went to Russia with my father, who was a famous psychiatrist, twice when I was a kid, 1959 and 1966, the height of the Cold War. There was science going back and forth between the West and the East, between the communist countries and the capitalist countries. It was possible that it was not an iron curtain. It was what modern historians of Europe called a nylon curtain. You could get back and forth. It wasn't that easy, but it could be done. It's not being done now. Russian science is really isolated. It's not only in the life sciences, by the way. My friend who was a chair of physics at University of Maryland, I asked a few years ago, what if the Russian cosmologists and physicists didn't show up at CERN in Geneva, where the big accelerator is? And he thought for a minute. He said, it really wouldn't make that much difference anymore. Russian science, physical science, engineering, and the life sciences aren't what they were. And so this is very unfortunate for our colleagues in Russia, but it is the case. But we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean, right? For global pharma in a divided or diminished world order, this is, I think, something that we need to follow very carefully. I heard the person who runs the pharmaceutical part of a major international global pharmaceutical company say a year ago, we cannot be Maha. We cannot be Make America Healthy Again. He went on to say, we are a science-based company. What are the rules now? I mean, this is the implication of that rhetorical question, right? Of his statement. What are the rules now? Going forward, business needs rules. We need to know what the red lines are. And in pharmaceuticals, we need to know how we're going to, what's the epistemology here, right? So I think you see where I'm going with this. But this also includes the core values of bioethics: prior review. If you're talking about a protocol, prior review of a protocol, and consent. Are those, are those the rules, or is this shifting now? I think we've had some warning signs about this. Some of you have followed, I'm sure many of you have followed the controversy about this hepatitis B study that was finally stopped. It was to take place in West Africa, in Guinea-Bissau, with infants. There is continuing criticism of China, members of Congress claiming that there are clinical trials going on with Uyghurs that are not registered. I'm not sure what to make of those allegations, but there's always the potential for slippage in any order, including in the way that pharmaceutical studies are being done. So back to 100,000-foot geopolitics, we have, Prime Minister Carney of Canada now is kind of a hero of the Davos set. This is not a transition, he said in Davos a few months ago. This is a rupture. The middle powers need to get up to the plate and now get organized. I asked myself, okay, well, that's interesting. What does that mean for science? Does that have meaning for science? Can the middle powers really become an alternative to the US and China? And what does that mean for bioethics? What does that mean for pharmaceutical research and development, for example? What does it mean for emerging medical technologies, like the many, many roles of AI and the many, many senses of AI? So these are the leading countries in biological sciences, according to Nature. And you can well imagine that starting with Germany and going down the list of the Netherlands, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of talent, there's a lot of science. Could they create their own science of a deglobalized research system? This is maybe the most interesting item in the spirit of that question that I've come across. The Accra reset. So Accra is the capital of Ghana. And I don't know anything about President Mahama of Ghana. But he said, we are going to create a system of global health that does not depend on the global north. We're going to create a global south system. Now, I don't know if you can do that, right? But it's a very interesting concept. And you can see that he's got people from Africa, from Latin America. He's got Peter Piot, obviously very distinguished guy, European, the Brits involved. Is this going to go anywhere? Are we going to hear about any of this 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now? I don't know. It's a very interesting question. But it also raises the question, what are the bioethical rules in this system? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to leave it at that rhetorical question and just give you these other, I don't know, I haven't figured this out yet. What does this all mean for bioethics? This is only the first slide. There's a second slide that I had to add a few weeks ago. What about a principle of reciprocity? We don't really have reciprocity in bioethics. We've got respect for autonomy that has been very successful. Some would say too successful. The anti-vaccination movement really likes autonomy. And so, do we have a notion of reciprocity in our bioethics? How do we do that? Are there new familiar themes that we need to reassess, like benefit sharing, post-pandemic? Have we paid enough attention to biosafety and biosecurity? I think we have not. I think in general, public health ethics is largely under-theorized, except for a very few people, Jim Childress, Norm Daniels, Dan Wickler, but in general, not a proper part of most of what we talk about in bioethics. We know that there was bioethics nationalism. Sergio and I actually wrote a paper about this in one case in Argentina. Where you lived made a big difference in terms of which vaccine you got. And which vaccine you got depended very much on what deal your government had made with which company. I'll leave it at that. Sergio can tell you more about this than I can with respect to that case. But this is not something that was anticipated before the pandemic. I mean, the notion of vaccine nationalism, or you could call, and I've written about this as well, bioethics nationalism, this was not anticipated, and this is a reality. So here's something to think about from my friend Judith Sándor at the Central European University in Budapest, which is now also happening to be in Vienna. There's going to be an election in Hungary shortly. That'll be quite interesting. It means a lot for this university and means a lot for bioethics, I think, in its way. Judith argues that basically we need to pay more attention to human rights in the setting of bioethics. These are two movements that have been kind of on parallel tracks. But I think as we're being pushed up against a wall by events, we need to think more about the role of human rights in bioethics. And this is not an accident, I'm repeating the slide, got to contextualize what we're talking about this morning. Then there's the war. And so this is the only time you'll hear the leader of the Italian Communist Party, who was imprisoned by Mussolini for, I think, 10 years, quoted in a bioethics talk, but I think it is pertinent. Antonio Gramsci, in his prison notebooks, I know if I was imprisoned with lots of medical problems by Mussolini, I would not be writing a lot of philosophy. But Gramsci did, and he refers here to an interregnum in which a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. This is the interwar period between this is the 1930s, between the world wars. One might guess, despite Yogi Berra's warning about not making predictions, that we are in an interregnum of a sort. And what that means for bioethics, I think, is quite important, and we need to be talking about this. So thank you to my colleagues in Florida. Thanks, Sergio. Look forward to seeing many of you, I hope, in person, in the real world, in person in Miami in a few weeks.
Thank you, John. This was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed that a lot. And even as a conclusion of this meeting, all what you mentioned And with all the failures and weakness of the liberal order that you mentioned and the critiques, all what we have been discussing in this meeting, in one way or the other, is related to that,
Indeed.
to all the rules-based liberal order. And the question you mentioned also the South-South initiatives. This is interesting also because uh, there is also an illiberal bioethics, I would say.
Yeah.
And there are some ideologues in Latin America and some other places in which they are using a different model. All what we have now, even in research ethics, for example, which is my field, CIOMS, Helsinki, and UNESCO and WHO, it's based on covenants supported by values. And those are the values that we abide for. And those are based particularly in the respect of human rights.
Yeah.
So your question, and I am wondering too, if this order finally ends or have a mutation, what will be the future of the new bioethics that we will see? And I don't want to make analogies, but I want to remind to many that totalitarian states has their own bioethics in many ways.
Yeah.
They didn't call bioethics, they call ethics. But basically, even Nazi Germany had their own ethics education. So there is not a guarantee that what we know today and what we discuss today will stay in the future. So it's interesting to
No, our system is based on voluntarism, essentially.
Yeah.
We have decided, and this is not written in stone, that, like, for example, universal human equality, so that the same rules in clinical trials apply all over the world. We've decided that those rules must apply, but that's not written in stone. And as you say, scholars of Nazi Germany have pointed out that they had a utilitarian ethic. It deviated from the rules that were put in place by the Weimar Republic, which would be very familiar to us and were very sophisticated, but they were ignored. And so, this is not Moses came down from the mountaintop, but he might have dropped one of the tablets, as a famous comedian pointed out in a movie about the history of the world, Part One. And we have 10 commandments instead of 15. So this is a voluntary system, and we are so inured, we're so accustomed to it that it sort of comes as a shock that it might not be around forever. To the previous point you make, and I heard this from a colleague up here in Boston yesterday too. This fellow said, when I go to other parts of the world, they know about the principles, but they don't really like the principles because they don't really fit their culture all that much. And of course, there are communities, as you well know, as all the clinicians know, there are communities in the US that really aren't necessarily buying into the principles, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So the principles have succeeded very well to help create, you should pardon the expression, a bioethics industry.
Mm-hmm.
The distinguished philosopher a number of years ago said, to be a philosopher, you need to have read the Critique of Pure Reason. To be a bioethicist, you need to have read the Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And not diminishing in any way, but I love Tom and Jim. It's a hugely important book. It structured the field. It made the field possible in many ways. But it was the Belmont report and the principles, particularly the early editions, came about in a setting of human experiments, not in a setting of a global pandemic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thanks again. That was a wonderful presentation. I don't see questions for the audience. I don't know if Ray, Cathy, Michael.
Let me just
comment.
a couple comments, Dr. Moreno. Wonderful talk. Find myself in agreement. I was a student of Beecham and Childress, and I was in Georgetown when that book came out, and I can remember getting in a conversation with Tom Beecham about this seems way too simplistic. And we had quite a discussion of that issue. I worked for him. I was a grad student working for him.
Remember.
And he said, "You're missing the point." And I said, "Well, what's the point?" He said, "This is something that is publicly accessible that people can hang their hat on.
Right.
It's not the final word, but it gives a publicly accessible framework." And that always stuck with me, that just in and of itself is extremely valuable to have a publicly accessible framework.
Right.
And to take that a step further, as you pointed out, we're under attack, as you will. Science is under attack. Facts are under attack. But there is something about having the voluntary framework, as you put it, that is publicly accessible and makes sense to people.
Right.
And I'm a scientific optimist myself, in spite of the facts, but that's my faith. And what I think there's something to be said that the scientific progress is something that you can slow down, but you can't ever really stop it. And the reason is because it works. And just so happens today we're seeing a ship that just went around the moon and is landing today. Science works. And I think so scientific progress, drug development, we had that system because it actually works. And so I think I have some optimism that, yes, we're in a low period, just like we did when the Luddites were making their stand and they lost.
Well, Ray, I very much appreciate that. I'm trying to soak up your optimism through my screen. This is part of a much longer conversation, but yeah.
Thank you so much for being
the final
here.
analysis, I think, yeah, we suck it up. We'll get there. We'll get back there.
Ray, you are invited to come to Miami. It will be on Thursday, April the 30th. So
Looking forward to it.
I'll make a point of it. Thank you.
I always wear my sunscreen.
Thank you very much, John, again. And thank you for Dr. Lively, Dr. Hoover, and Ray, indeed, for your support, and Esther for helping us in all these. Let me see. There is no question here. For helping us to create all this conference. So I really appreciate all of you who joined us this morning. And I think that without any further comments, I think we are adjourned now. So again, we are planning new activities for the Florida Bioethics Network. You will learn the slides will be available in a site that Esther will let you know. So please complete the evaluation and have a good rest of the day, a wonderful weekend, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.